Hello, everybody, and welcome to another debate dissection. We're here to cut up this corpse of a debate that is very, very old now. Welcome to the part 2 between Dr. Richard Carrier and Dr. William Lane Craig on Did Jesus Rise from the Dead? Now, this is a part 2. If you do want part 1, see lovely Better Than Ember's channel has the part 1 up there, so don't forget to drop in and see that if you have not seen it. And we sort of got about halfway through, but firstly, Ember, how are you?
Getting ready inauguration day, and so we're
I cannot even imagine. I can't imagine. I don't know how I would feel. I would have to be in that situation to know how I would feel. So my heart goes out to all people who like sane countries, because not even inaugurated and already the insanity has started. It's pretty wild.
Yep.
Yeah. No, I hear you. I really do. Oh, thank you, Pragmatic Crystal. Big shout out to PC in the comments.
PC.
Thank you so much. Yeah,
PC. I know how I can do it.
Yeah. It's hard. Everything's hard at the moment.
I should just do the sign language.
Yeah,
it's easier.
Yeah. So if you are here for the first time, welcome to the show. We're basically taking apart some of the biggest debates in history, as well as some of the more modern ones that we feel have relevance to our community. This one is one that is ancient old. Look, Carrier looks so young. He looks like he's just out of college. And
he looks like he just entered college. Oh my goodness.
Right. Yeah, he looks so young. And so also, we were just talking that the sound is absolutely tragic because the recording is tragic. Like we were sort of suggesting it must have been on a handheld VHS recorder or something. But it is actually a really good debate. So I think we're up to Richard Carrier just did his first rebuttal. So this is a very structured debate, unlike some of the ones that we do cover, where I don't think there is a discussion. I think it's that sort of rebuttals kind of thing, which I'm totally fine with. And I do like a structured debate. I do like the discussions in debates, but I also like the structured ones. So yeah.
Yeah, there's a place for all of them. And sometimes we like to see a mix and match. This one was set up to be 20-minute intros, which both sides have completed.
Right.
That's part 1. And then we've got 12-minute rebuttals, 8-minute rebuttals, and 5-minute closings.
Yeah.
And then they did have a Q&A, but that's a separate video. We normally cut the Q&As off anyway, so whatever. It's fine.
Yeah, unless we know there's a good question in there or something like that, because usually the Q&As are they're not as good as the people actually putting forward their arguments. Sometimes the questions you go, wow, that's a dumb question, like seriously. So I guess let's start, I guess. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you do enjoy the content as well. And, if you have any suggestions for debates we should cover or things that we should be doing, leave a comment and sort of suggest it, and we will find it, dig it up, and find out the cause of death, because that's what we're here for. So, yeah.
No matter how old and stinky.
And no matter how old and stinky, yes. Actually, some of the debates, sort of the rise of the new atheists, I know that always triggers the theist when you sort of say, hey, the rise of new atheists, because they really hate it. They absolutely loathe it. But it had some amazing debates. Hitchens, you had, even the Four Horsemen, Dawkins, and all of those. They did some amazing debates, but they are old now. They are old. But, I just, what, for my money, Alex O'Connor is doing some amazing debates, like just amazing. Him and who was it? Phil.
Oh, Skydive Phil.
Yeah, Skydive Phil. I can't remember his name. That was a fantastic debate. That was fantastic. From their side, I'm not sure the Neckles were or Connectleys were very very impressive, but.
I mean,
from their side.
Yeah, it was kind of typical for them, Cliff flew off the handle, and Stewart just kind of threw vagaries. It's what they do.
Stewart's usually a bit better, and he flew off the handle as well, which is kind of worrying because he's usually the like it's almost like they're good cop and bad cop kind of thing, like reasonable, and Cliff just yells at you kind of thing. So it's almost works as that good cop bad cop, but he kind of flew off the handle as well, which is surprising. But like, even did you know that Inspiring Philosophy, who is what's his name? I can't remember his name.
Mike Jones?
Yeah, Mike Jones made a video about how not to argue for theism using them as an example. So, you know, it really was a case of, yeah, that's really bad. You know, that's a really bad performance. You know, when people are attacking you over it, I don't know. It's just, yeah. Either you've done something and people haven't gotten it, or you've just done really badly. And I would have to agree on with I'd agree on very little with Mike Jones, but that's something I do agree on. That is not how to, you know, telling people, oh well, your immortal soul is in jeopardy. That is not how to argue for theism. It's not, you know, like it really is not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If IP and us are on the same side, you done fucked up.
Yeah. But Alex is amazing. I really enjoy his work. Dr. Carrier, I mean, I don't take the mythicist position. And we were talking about this last week, like whether the mythicist position is one that, you know, should be taken, why people take that position. I get the position that he's taking. I go with consensus of scholars because I'm not a scholar myself. You know, I prefer Bart Ehrman's take on it. Like, yeah, okay, we can say that he was a real itinerant preacher. Nothing else follows from that you've demonstrated. Like that is all.
Yeah, I don't know. In most areas, in most questions, consensus of scholars carries a heavy weight. But in the case of New Testament study specifically, considering the overwhelming majority of scholars are not only Christians, but were required to sign statements of faith saying they affirm the Bible is literally true and whatever, it kind of calls their credibility into question. So I don't know if the consensus is worth much on that one.
Okay, no, that's fair. I think that I'm not sure. I would imagine it probably is a majority that are Christians. I don't see why being. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know about that one. But yeah, no, that's fair. That's fair. I think it is, but it's kind of, to me, as I was mentioning last week, it's kind of it doesn't matter to me that much.
Yeah,
Like,
for
I
sure.
could say, hey, he's a mythicist, or hey, he was just an ordinary person wandering around. You still haven't gotten to any kind of, you know, raised from the dead. Or any kind of, you know, I mean, he could have been a real guy. Like Carrier's sort of his statement is, well, they saw him, but they hallucinated. And we know that these grief hallucinations can actually happen. So he's got a very valid point there. But, you know, he could have been a real person and they hallucinated, or they just could have hallucinated. Like either is absolutely possible. So I don't know. I do think Paul just had a hallucination. I think he just, you know, imagined what he saw on the road to Damascus. A bright light and a voice is not evidence of anything, especially when other people don't see the bright light, and he acknowledges as much. So, yeah. Anyway, I'll get this thing started. But let's go. And this is just at the end of Carrier's first rebuttal, I believe.
I know that Richard wanted to debate tonight the general reliability of the Gospels, and I'm really sorry that he's chosen to pursue that tack, despite our agreement that that wouldn't be the topic tonight. But let me just say a couple of words about.
Well, that's a very pointed statement.
It is. Like you can't discuss the topic tonight, which is, did Jesus rise? Did Jesus really exist to rise, without discussing if the Gospels are reliable? Because if you don't if you rely on the Gospels, if you consider them reliable, then you're
Yes.
granting Christianity's claims. If the Gospels aren't reliable, then you have to get them off the table. It's a question that has to be answered for this topic.
And I think that William Lane Craig is hinging a lot of his arguments on the Gospels are reliable. I mean, he made claims to Josephus Arimathea and that the burial was done by him. And so, like, if you're in a debate and you open that door, I don't see why it should not be pursued. I mean, sort of expecting the scope to just be on the reliability of just this one section, I'm not sure why that should be the case. Because did he use any other sections of the Bible as a testament to the reliability of them? I believe he did, didn't he?
I think he talked a bit about the epistles, but
yeah, Paul's epistles, because that was a big thing, right? Like, he was sort of saying, hey, why would people change their opinion? I'm not sure about that one. Look, I'm in two minds. If you've agreed not to go down a certain area, then you do in a debate after you've agreed to it up front. It is kind of dodgy, but at the same time, if you're talking about the resurrection, I don't know how the reliability of the text is not going to come up.
Mm-hmm.
And that is directly addressing the question, because William Lane Craig, he's definitely using the text as evidence that it happened. Like, to say, well, I'm going to use these texts, but you're not allowed to attack their reliability, generally, that seems a bit ridiculous to me.
Yeah, it's to borrow from the way these guys often describe it, it's like holding a criminal trial and saying, okay, I'm going to call some witnesses. You can't challenge their credibility, though.
Right.
That's not the topic we're discussing.
Right. Yeah, it's really weird. Okay.
This. In the first place, the vast majority of scholars do not think that the Gospels are of the genre of myth, but rather of historical biography.
I'm not sure
R.T.
that's
France,
true.
a New Testament scholar, writes, at the level of their literary and historical character, we have good...
I don't think that's true. Even like Christian biblical scholars don't consider it to be a book of history. I would push back very seriously on that, because it does not read like a history book. It has the components of at least a religious storytelling. I don't think that's actually true. I mean, I don't know how long ago this debate was. It was probably over 20 years or so. The consensus may have shifted on that. I'm not sure, because like, as you said, there was definitely a problem with scholars in the area being all Christian and having to take statements of faith. But I think that has actually shifted a bit, because there are more, not only atheist scholars, but Muslim scholars and, other people. I remember that New Testament scholar that was a Muslim that went on Fox News and got absolutely lambasted for it, because how dare you as a Muslim be interested in the New Testament, and he's like, well, I'm a scholar of religion. That's what I do.
Yeah. How dare you be religious and an academic?
Yeah,
it's unheard of.
But not our religion. That was actually a very funny thing. If you ever see it, it's basically him saying, "Look, I'm a scholar, but why would you investigate this? It's my job." Like, I don't. And this is the thing. Like, so I think when he's saying that, maybe it was true at his time and not true now. Maybe because scholarly consensus does shift over when. Scholars change their minds. They do shift their position. But if you're going to use that, which is very, it's not a problem, right? If you're not an expert in the area, but if you are someone like Dr. Lane Craig and you say, hey, scholars agree that it's a book of history, if they then agree that it's not a book of history, then you've got to wear that. You've got to say, well, if I'm going to use it as, a consensus among experts as evidence, if that consensus changes, then you've just got to accept that and embrace it, which I don't think he does. I think he still sees it as history, no matter what the vast majority of scholars would say. I don't think that it's, it's not, like, to say it doesn't have history in it, that, obviously it has history in it. Obviously, it has Pontius Pilate in it. He was the governor of Judea at the time. It does have historical things in it, but that doesn't mean it was a history book. Yeah, and I'm just looking it up now. No, most mainstream scholars do not accept it as history. So, William Lane Craig now has to wear that and say, well, it's not a history book anymore. I wonder if he's actually changed his tact or whether he still refers to it as a history book.
I doubt he has.
Yeah, mostly apparently because it doesn't have a single historical context. It varies over many centuries, and the intentions of the authors varied over many centuries. There was author bias, so the authors wrote about events that happened long before they were alive, and they were not intended to be historical accurate. There's many historians consider the Bible to be mythological and the Gospels to be largely or entirely myths. It can be used as a supportive document when combined with other historical sources. So it can be used as a supportive document for certain historical events that have occurred, but it's not intended to be used as a history, and the authors never intended it to be used as a history book. So, it's just not a history book. I'm sorry.
Reason to treat the Gospels seriously as a source of information on the life and teaching of Jesus. Ancient historians have sometimes commented that the degree of skepticism with which New Testament scholars approach their sources is far greater than would be thought justified in any other branch of ancient history. Indeed, many ancient historians...
What? No. The authors... What? No. What skepticism? The authors didn't write down, hey, I am this person writing as the, and I don't believe this kind of thing. I mean, you have Paul, who basically wrote all about Jesus, even though he'd never met him. I'm so confused as to what skepticism the authors showed. Number one, who were the authors? Because if you say, for the Gospels, if you say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were they? We don't know that. Please demonstrate that is the case.
Yeah. And in fact, there's we've mentioned previously that the Mark we have today is not the same Mark that Tacitus wrote about, because Tacitus's description tells of a story that's quite a bit different. I think he described it as a poem, if I'm not mistaken, which our Mark very much does not. Right. So there's a problem with, the extra biblical references to things, but also, as Dr. Carrier said last week, the Matthew, Luke, and John all reference Mark. They're retellings of the story of Mark with different variations. Mark, in turn, is clearly fictional. It's following the Greek mythological archetype note for note, and ends with, and they told no one.
Yeah.
It's a story. It's always been a story. But this Mark isn't the Mark the people in that era we're talking about. So we're missing something. All of it is more than a little suspect.
Yeah, and Tacitus is a reliable historian. That's the thing. He was absolutely meticulous with what he wrote down. That people often want to say, "Oh, well, Tacitus wrote that Jesus rose from the dead," and Tacitus did not. What he wrote was there is a bunch of people running around called Christians that believe a man rose from the dead. That is not the same thing as recording that a person actually did rise from the dead. No, there's a bunch of people that believe it. It would be like me saying, hey, there's a bunch of people called Scientologists that think that Lord Xenu is the galactic overlord. That doesn't mean that I'm saying that Xenu is actually the galactic overlord. It means I'm writing about Scientologists. So it's important to know these sort of, I'm not going to say tricks, these sort of conflations that are being used in apologetics, where they sort of say, hey, there's Josephus who writes about him and Tacitus, there's all these extra, and I think even William Lane Craig in part one said, oh, the extra biblical sources are, there's tons of them. No, there's not. What there is there's tons of people writing about the beliefs of Christians, not about the actual event. So that conflation, be aware of that there's nothing outside the Bible. Now, Josephus did say a man rose from the dead who was the Messiah. There's a problem there. Number one, that particular passage is very, very awkward in its writing, and Josephus was a very fluid writer. He was a very good writer. And number two, we know that up until his dying day, Josephus was a very devout Jewish man, right?
Oh, so there's a third problem with that Josephus passage. Nobody mentions it until the 4th century, I believe. The church father called Origen. He's the first one to trot this out. And David Fitzgerald paints the picture with this one, because if that were in Josephus before then, why would no one reference it? And after Origen, nobody mentions it for another couple hundred years until centuries have gone by and somebody looks back at what Origen wrote and said, oh, hey, here's this version of Josephus that has this extra passage that's useful to us. It's like it's almost as if it didn't exist, it got interpolated, and then everybody else was too embarrassed to use it because of their copies of Josephus clearly did not have that passage.
Right. So, and I want to mention that word that you said, interpolation. What that is when a text exists and another author, for various reasons, comes and puts extra text into it. They basically slip it in there in order to further some kind of goal. So we're very aware of Christian interpolation, basically them changing documents to support their religious position. This has been something that we've been aware of for quite some time. So we know that Josephus is a problem, because as a devout Jew, he would never refer to Jesus as the Messiah. Or else, if he did, he would be a Christian, and he never was. We know this to his dying day. So it's a massive problem. Nearly every single New Testament author, that sort of refers to it, does realize that they think it's a forgery. We're absolutely overwhelmingly confident that was interpolated by some early Christian. As Amber said, it wasn't there, then suddenly it was, and people still didn't use it until a couple of centuries later, when everyone's forgotten what he really wrote. They drag these documents out as sort of extra biblical evidence. And there was a lot of this stuff going on, Christians just inserting extra biblical evidence for their beliefs into stuff, which, I think that if you've dealt with very zealous Christians before, it's not something that I would be surprised about, like it really isn't.
Would count themselves fortunate to have 4 such responsible accounts written within a generation or two of the events. The decision as to how far a scholar is willing to accept the record that they offer is likely to be influenced more by his openness to a supernaturalist worldview than by strictly historical considerations.
Okay, so here's where the philosophy comes in, right? This is so William Lane Craig has gone out of the realm of historical analysis and into philosophy. and he's making sort of a philosophical thing that, hey, if you don't accept supernatural things, you won't ever accept the validity of this document. And it's like, well, historians don't. They generally will not say, well, this contains supernatural events. We're going to consider them real. And what's interesting about this statement is that it is so narrowly focused on the New Testament, because if you're studying Hindu documents, if a historian went, well, I'm open to the supernatural, I'm going to consider, Hanuman, the monkey god, as doing everything in the document, William Lane Craig would have a problem with it, because it's not the right kind of supernatural. It's not the Christian supernatural. Like, what historian would he accept does that? Well, we know that Buddha is real because, the 5 pillars of heaven in the stored journey from the East happened. Like, nobody would accept this from historians. Nobody. But he wants them to, with regards to the Bible. And I think that that's a grave mistake, because either we do acknowledge supernatural things or we don't acknowledge supernatural things in history. You can't cherry pick what you want to accept and what you don't want to accept.
Yeah, it's very clearly a double standard, because
yes,
as we've talked about in previous episodes, though not for a while, there's Sai Baba, and
yeah.
a mystic from India who performed miracles witnessed by millions of people, supposedly even including raising the dead, and some of them are caught on video. There are hundreds of thousands of people still alive today. He passed away in 2011, but there's people still around, and no Christian alive accepts that as valid evidence for supernatural stuff. That's better evidence than anything for Jesus on every level, and they won't accept it. But then they turn around and say, oh, but this ancient book written by who knows who and edited by how many people, that's reliable, though. Okay.
but it's more the thing that will, your acceptance of it should be based upon your acceptance of the supernatural. And that is, I feel like he's being really disingenuous. I feel like he's sort of saying, well, you should accept it because it's my supernatural belief, not just any supernatural belief.
Yeah, he's full of shit. As he mentioned in the debate with Christopher Hitchens, one of our earlier ones. It's in the playlist, which y'all can go back and watch. That was a fun one. Ultimately, when it gets right down to it, he says, the reasons don't matter. I felt a burning in my heart, and I knew it was the Holy Ghost.
Yeah.
That's why Craig believes. And that's why he thinks everyone else should believe him, because to him, the reasons don't actually matter, and they shouldn't to you either, which makes him a dishonest POS.
Well, I was watching sort of a discussion between these two philosophers recently. I can't remember the names, but they were sort of saying, and it was interesting, the Christian philosopher was talking about the sort of ontological argument, which sort of goes along the lines of, if a maximally powerful or a hugely powerful being exists, or a omnipowerful being exists, and it exists in some possible universe, then it exists in this one, etc., etc. The one that I'm talking about. Just the mere fact of being overwhelming. Yeah, and people have described as sort of arguing or defining a god into existence kind of thing, which he pushed back on, and I understand why, but even he said, well, I wouldn't use this to convert somebody, right? It's something to reinforce a belief, not create one out of somebody that does not believe, because it doesn't really have that convincing power. So all of William Lane Craig's arguments is sort of, his philosophical musings, his arguments, his books, they're not actually to convince anybody. They won't convince anybody. And I think he knows that. They are to reinforce belief within Christians that they're already what they believe is the right thing. And I think that's very telling, because, things like Alex O'Connor and philosophers on the atheistic side, or the, skeptical side, they will convince people with their philosophical arguments, absolutely convince people. But, not, it's kind of, and the thing that gets me about William Lane Craig being a doctor of philosophy is the thing that convinced him. The other thing, aside from that, is Pascal's wager, which is like one of the worst arguments you could ever put. Like, it is so bad that they don't even use it anymore as an argument, because it is so vulnerable to being torn apart that people start to think, oh yeah, maybe I shouldn't even believe in this. It actually is an argument that works against them, which is just sort of hilarious. And, you know, the fact that William Lane Craig found that compelling is incredible, to be honest with you. It's incredible.
The majority of New Testament scholars today recognize that the Gospels are not of the genre of myth. They're of the genre of ancient biography. According to Craig Keener.
Yeah, but that's not really history. That's not really history. They are, like, even if you say, hey, they're not myth, they're still tales. They're still stories. They're not, you know, in order to be an ancient biography, we've got to say that they were. So when we consider a history book, like, we might consider something written by Tacitus to be history, right? And that's because we know the intention of Tacitus was to accurately record everything that happened, right? And he was scrupulous about citing where he got stuff, what his sources were, etc. That's why we consider it history. Because we don't know who wrote these books, we cannot say that their aim was to accurately record history, because we don't even know who they were. We know who Tacitus was. We know what his intention was. We know that he considered himself at least a accurate historian. Like, he would try to give the most accurate accounting he could. But we don't know that for the Gospels. We have no idea. So, you know, they could have been a cult follower who just wanted to, you know, tell these stories. So I don't know about this. He's taking a real big hinge on, you know, I'd love to show him this in a debate and say, hey, because the consensus has shifted to more mythology, do you now support that it is mythology? And watch him squirm.
Yeah,
that would
could be fun.
Gospel scholars, all four Gospels fit the general genre of ancient biography, the life of a prominent person. And these biographies have a historical interest. Keener says that the Gospels use recent traditions, and that those that can be checked are careful in their use of sources, suggests that the Gospels should be placed among the most reliable.
Careful in their use of sources? Did anybody cite Mark for copying it? No. No, they didn't. It was an obvious copy. What was it? Matthew obviously copied Mark. Obviously. But, you know, nowhere does it say, hey, I copied this guy Mark. Like, what? The most reliable? Like, I don't know how you get to that. How is it in any way reliable? This is something that I've brought up before. Like, people have said to me, direct to my face, that the Gospels are the most reliable accounts of history that we have. And I've had to point out, okay, you know, we don't know who wrote them. We know that passages were added, like in the long ending of Mark. We talked about that last week, that Mark 16, 9 to 20 was an entire section was added after the fact. We have all of these interpolations through the rest of Christian stuff. I don't see any reason why they wouldn't put it in their own books. And we don't have the originals to see if they changed it all from what was originally written. We know these are copies upon copies of translations upon copies. We know that they're not the originals. So, and the response that I got was, that doesn't mean it didn't happen. And I'm like, yeah, but how is it reliable? I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm saying, how can you make the claim that it's reliable with all of those problems? That, you know, it's because of people like William Lane Craig. He just says they are the most reliable texts, historical texts. And people believe it. People actually believe this horse hockey. Like,
well,
why?
They're motivated. It's keyed to their beliefs. That's where they get the story from, you know? Like, as Carrier mentioned last week, Paul's writings much earlier than even if you believe Mark was written with the intention of passing down historical information, it still was in oral tradition for almost 2 generations at earliest. That's still a range, and the earliest is around 73 BC or CE rather. And but setting that aside for a minute, Paul never mentions the empty tomb, which is kind of an important thing. It's almost like they hadn't made up that part of the story yet, because if he knew about it, you can bet he would have hammered it all the time.
Yeah, it is the single most important evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. If you are taking it as, you know, people's testimony, the fact that they went back where a boulder was rolled in front of a tomb and no one had been in there and there was no, that is probably the single most important piece of evidence. And he just doesn't mention it. And he doesn't mention all of the zombies climbing out of their graves and wandering around. Like, nobody mentions that until, what is it? What's that in? That's in Matthew, I believe.
Matthew, yes.
So until Matthew, nobody mentions that. Don't forget, Mark was the first one written. Mark was written about 75 to 79 CE. Nobody mentions it at all.
And then Luke immediately abandons it. Luke is like, nope, that went too far. Nope, we need. But even John, where we've got, you know, super Jesus with all his divine powers from birth and all that, nothing about the zombie army. He's like, nope, that is a bridge too far.
It's almost like, you know, you can see the sort of splintering of Christianity already based upon what Jesus can and can't do. You know, there's more fantastical ones where, you know, and I mean, the long ending of Mark as the, you know, drinking poison and being bitten by snakes and not being affected. And we know that's 100% not true. Like, it just isn't true.
It's almost like that was propaganda put in to try to get early Christians to unalive themselves so they'd stop, you know, being a threat to Roman society or something.
Well, we don't know. I mean, I'm not a historian or a biblical scholar, but, you know, snakes have held, like, so in Hellenistic world, snakes have great importance, right? They're serpents and snakes are seen as a sort of healing thing. So it may have been power over that. It may have been power over another. It might have been symbology for power over the Hellenistic world. We don't know. Like, we don't know why it was put in there. No idea.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's all kinds of exegesis and eisegesis and hermeneutics that you can get into on that one. But also, as you touched on briefly, the 4 gospels that are accepted canon today weren't the only gospels, and which ones got picked wasn't decided for a few hundred years. So for a while, the earliest Christians had, you know, a dozen different flavors of Jesus to choose from.
Yes. Yeah.
Of ancient biographies. Just to take one example, the example of Barabbas, the acclamation of the people, acclamatio populi, played a significant role in Roman legal administration. And there are numerous examples of Roman magistrates who heeded a crowd's wishes. For example, in Egypt in AD 85, the Roman governor released an accused to the crowd, even though he deserved a scourging. And why could
so just because there is an accurate depiction of something that happens in Roman life in these provinces doesn't mean that the entire story is true. Like, this is the problem. You have Pontius Pilate, who was, you know, the governor of Judea at the time, and we know that's true. We found coins with his face on them. We absolutely know that he existed, right? And so he's trying to say, well, because it gets these details accurately, the rest must have happened. And that is not true. I could write a fanfic about America collapsing and, you know, write about Donald Trump, right? And write a sort of a dystopian novel about Donald Trump. If we find it 1,000 years in the future, it doesn't mean that all of that happened exactly as I said. It means that I've used stuff from current events to describe things that I want to write down. like this whole thing of, well, it describes something accurate. I think Matt Delahunty uses sort of a Spider-Man example. Just because Spider-Man lives in New York and New York's a real place doesn't mean that Spider-Man exists. And this is somewhat the same. Of course, they're going to write about, you know, somebody like your example with Sai Baba. They would write about him wandering around India and visiting New Delhi and, you know, interacting with maybe the Prime Minister of India. That doesn't mean that everything he did is actually true. And, you know, just because the people who wrote it would have been aware of this, right? And it doesn't even, like, because you might say, oh, well, there's story about how the crowd could have released Jesus but didn't, basically. So that's what he's alluding to, that this was a real tradition among the, you know, the provinces of Rome, you know, sort of tying it into the where we know it happened in Egypt. The thing is that even if that didn't happen, the author could have written down that the crowd passed over Jesus for release because he knew of the tradition. Like it doesn't, it's, I don't know why he thinks this is compelling. It's really weird, right? So, you know, it's kind of like me writing that, hey, you know, these people did this crime, which never happened. You know, they broke into the Federal Reserve, which never happened, and the president pardoned them. And him saying, oh, well, people were pardoned by the president of the United States. That's compelling evidence that these things actually happened. No, it's not. I know that the president gives pardons. I just wrote it into my story. It's not. Yeah,
and then everyone clapped. Well, people do clap sometimes, so it's a legit story.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Someone in that time be named Barabbas. That would symbolize son of the father. There's nothing the matter with that as a Jewish name. So I don't think that you can impugn the evidence for the resurrection by a sort of general attack upon the gospel's reliability. Most scholars think that the 4 facts that I outlined are part of the historical core of the gospel, however you might want to judge other things in the gospels.
Yeah, I don't know about that one, Chief. Just quickly, sorry, I have the lovely and amazing Robin Webster giving out a readership, so I'm going to find it and put it on screen because I like to do that. Woohoo! Thank you so much, Robin. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate you. And that went out to Creation. You didn't hit anybody massive that time, but hey, I still think you're a sniper when it comes to those things. So my mind will never change on that. So winner, chicken dinner. Congratulations, Keyshawn. Enjoy your emotes and other benefits. Thank you. But Robin, so good to see you. So good to see you feeling better. That's awesome.
Yeah, and while we're on the subject, great to see everybody in the live chat. I've seen a whole bunch of people saying hello.
Oh, yeah.
Wonderful to see. Well, future people, if you're watching on replay, fantastic, super job. But do remember to ring the notification bell because we would love to see you join us in the live chat sometime.
Oh,
we have a ton of fun.
Yeah, and you know, even if you drop in for a little bit, oh, good, more than happy. No, I understand, Robin. No, I totally get it. Robin just says she has to miss sometimes. No, I get it. I know you always want to be here. She sometimes misses, and that's cool. All good. You know, I look, I could have an audience of 0 and still be doing this. I actually enjoy it so much, to be honest with you. So, but yeah, welcome along for the ride. It's good fun. But yeah, I mean, William Lane Craig, what are you doing? Like, you know, now, so he's kind of taking a position as trying to say, well, some of the details are correct, so Jesus must have been a real person. I don't think he's gotten there. I think he's gotten to, hey, the people that wrote it lived in the area at the time. That's, I think, all he can say, because they know of the customs and traditions and the events that were happening in the area at the time. That is, you know, all he's gotten to, because they know of the customs. Just because they know of the customs at the time doesn't mean that those can be applied to any one person. I don't think he's gotten there.
Now, before we look at those 4 facts, Richard did ask a general question. Why did Jesus appear only to the disciples and not to everyone? Well, the New Testament is clear that the purpose of the appearances was for commissioning the disciples for the task of world mission, not for convincing people in general that Jesus was risen from the dead.
But
Wouldn't it
why?
make the commission so much easier if he'd appeared to a ton of people? You'd written all their names down and they, asserted this. Why couldn't he do both? Like, a better argument would be he was afraid of being killed again. Like that. Except that doesn't fly with God being all powerful, because number one, he didn't look like Jesus. We've got to remember that. No one recognized him, kind of thing. It probably would have been a lot more convincing that he rose from the dead if people did recognize him. Because, for my mind, if somebody says I've risen from the dead and they don't look like the guy that died, I'm going to have questions. Like, why?
Yeah, like, what are you, Doctor Who? You've got a different face on, my guy.
Maybe Jesus was a Time Lord. You've cracked it. You've cracked it.
That's why
I believe
he's still with us today, because he's
right.
Yeah.
Just gets in the TARDIS and comes back in 2,000 years. Yeah, no, that's amazing. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know why he wouldn't appear to other people. It seems very, very flimsy. And if his, he basically, died to be risen again, proved that he rose again, and then he'd got to heaven or whatever, because nobody saw hair or hide of him after that point. Why was he afraid of being re-killed? As I give explanations that would be a better explanation than, those people were supposed to do the Great Commission. It would have been a lot easier to do the Great Commission if there was a couple of, 1,000 people that had seen him and seen him looking the same as when he died. It's so weird. It's so weird.
People who haven't yet heard the gospel won't be judged on the same basis as those who have. People will only be judged on the basis of the information that they have. Now, with that out of the way, let's look at those 4 factors.
I don't know.
It's like I've never gotten a citation on that. I mean, maybe it's based on a Bible verse, but if it is in the Bible that if you haven't heard about Jesus, you don't automatically go to hell for not believing in Jesus, then the moral thing would clearly be to never tell anyone about Jesus.
Yeah. And it kind of is weird that they sort of go, well, God cannot bear sin in his presence, so he has to forgive you, kind of thing, for that sin. But people in some tribe that's never heard of him, do they not sin? Does he forgive them because they don't know? And if so, why can't he forgive us for not knowing? You know what I mean? Like, it gets very, very weird. Like, why did anybody, any of the disciples, tell anybody, just, as you say, let them not know, and then their sin is fine because they don't know?
Yeah, I'm kind of seeing the opposite thing. I mean, granted, I'm doing just a quick Google search, but everything seems to be pointing to Romans 1, 18 through 20, where it talks about how the invisible works are clearly seen and everyone's without excuse. So whether you've heard of Jesus or not, you're still going to get judged, because it should be evident that Jesus is running, or whatever, all of that crap.
Okay. Well,
So I don't...
writing that.
What's that?
Who wrote Romans, or who's supposed to have written Romans?
Paul, although I can't remember off the top of my head if that is one of the forgeries or not.
Yeah. I mean, it starts with Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated unto the gospel of God. I mean, Paul sort of just proclaimed himself an apostle.
Oh, yeah. I mean, arguably that's why he had the vision, is because he's chasing Christians around all the time. He's like, man, these people it doesn't matter how many of them I kill. There's more. They keep popping up. Maybe if I just, if you can't beat them, join them, They don't seem to have a cohesive leadership. I could just claim a redemption arc, like, you know, Lee Strobel and J. Warner Wallace one day will do, and just basically take control of this whole movement. And then he did just that. It's pretty wild.
Yeah.
Oh, how am I going to phrase that?
That's the origin of the reprobate mind. That's... Ugh. Frigging Paul.
Let's try it the other way around and look up the forgeries of Paul.
Okay.
Oh, Let's see. Okay, the modern consensus as of right now is that the definitely accurate or definitely genuine letters of Paul are Romans 1, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon, however that one. There's several more that mixed results, and then there's a few that are definitely forgeries. But yeah, that Romans 1 passage where everyone already knows and they're just suppressing the truth, it's undisputed as a genuine letter from Paul.
Right, yeah. Ugh.
Facts on which I based my case tonight. First, the burial of Jesus. We saw that it was multiply attested, and that Joseph of Arimathea is the historical person who buried Jesus, and Richard had no response to either of these two lines of evidence.
Wait, who recorded that Joseph of Arimathea was the person that buried him? Wasn't that in the Bible?
Yeah, and in fact, that's another controversy, is that Joseph of Arimathea doesn't appear in any historical record ever anywhere except the Gospels.
He's a biblical figure. He's not. So in John 19, he's described as a secret disciple of Jesus, but there's no other place where this man is recorded, either as a disciple or otherwise.
And additionally, Arimathea is another location that nobody knows where the fuck it is. It doesn't seem to be an existing location that a person could actually be from.
Yeah.
Which is also kind of weird. Oh, let's see which books is.
So there's a apocryphal for fuck's sake, that word. Apocryphal, friggin' hell.
Yeah, apocryphal.
Apocryphal, gospel. He's apparently in the apocryphal gospel of Peter from the 2nd century. He's in the gospel of Nicodemus, 4th or 5th century. So he's not. Yeah, I don't know. There's no extra biblical source that this person even existed, much less actually buried Jesus or provided a tomb for him at all. Apocryphal, Yep.
Secondly, I talked about the support for the empty tomb. First, the burial account supports the accuracy of the empty tomb story. No response from Richard. Secondly, I said the empty...
He had a response. I thought he did have a response. The historical... No, there's no... What? You're basically saying, hey, the Gospels are true in the burial. And we have no reason to believe that. Empty tomb? Okay. And didn't he bring up the contradictions between the empty tomb stories? Like that sometimes it was the women that found it, sometimes it was, one woman that found it.
Yeah, and how many angels were there, and was there a
Right.
dude inside or not? And there's so much that just doesn't frickin' add up. But
Mhm.
also the whole, it may have been Richard, it may have been us, because I remember getting excited over the fact, but I can't remember if it was inspired or just part of the flow of the conversation. But the fact that no one knows where the tomb is, even
Right.
though the city has been continuous, it has had Christians in it
Oh, yeah,
since the
yeah.
first century. How did they lose the site of the most important miracle in human history?
Well, there's a number of tombs in Jerusalem. It could be any of them. I think only Ron Wyatt claims to have found the actual tomb of Jesus, which he can't show anybody and
Of
can't,
course.
demonstrate at all that he's found this thing. So I don't see that necessarily as being a problem, because how are you supposed to tell the tomb of Jesus from any other tomb? Like it just there's so many tombs in Jerusalem, but the whole idea is this place. If that did happen, it should have been a holy site to the people that believed it early on in the religion. Whether or not they were persecuted, they still would have said, "Hey, this is where it is because this is the most important site." So I think there's validity to that. That
Yeah,
for some reason,
that'd be the conversion tool. They'd say to
right?
new people, "Hey, have you heard about this Jesus dude?" They'd say no. They'd tell them the story and say, "Come with
Mhm,
me. I will show you the damn tomb."
right.
And then you see the tomb is empty, and you're like, "Holy crap!" I mean, this proves absolutely nothing, but
Yeah.
it's more plausible than if there were a body in there. So there's something anyway.
Right. Right.
But like they'd use it. It would constantly be getting pilgrimage to from the very beginning. And it's
And
just not there.
if it was a history document, as they claim, it would have a, this is the tomb lay, eastwards of this church, or it of this monument, or it would have had like some kind of description of where the damn thing was if
Yeah,
it was a
or they'd
history
mark
book.
it.
Right, but it's not
I
a
mean,
history book.
yeah, they were leaving marks all over the place. Like the first century Christian meeting places have the little damn fish symbol, and sometimes there are trident symbols. And they left marks as the authorities who were persecuting them became aware of the marks they were leaving. They'd change to a different marker, but they always left markers so they'd know the safe gathering places. They definitely would have left a marker on the tomb so that new
Yeah,
believers who hadn't been shown which
yeah.
one could find it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And Victoria, you are Victoria. Welcome. I'm joking. Please, I am absolutely joking. You're totally fine. I'm 100% joking. Um, I'll just give you a bonk for good measure. I like bonking my chat. That's
Oh my.
nobody soundbite that. All right, don't nobody sound like
It's
that. That could
it's
get me
been
into
an
real trouble.
interesting day with the innuendo. I mean, I started with Live from the Hive over on Breeze, and
Oh,
she threatened me with bread. I mean, I
she
like bread.
threatened you with bread.
Yep.
Threatened you with bread. Like to beat you with a baguette or something? What are we talking about here? I don't.
She was reviewing a video where the person she was responding to was talking about armadillos, and there's
Okay.
a couple special features about the way they reproduce that's helping them spread really fast across the United
Okay.
States.
Yeah.
And he phrased it as, when a female gets bred, she can hold on to the fetus, yada yada. And I was like, ooh, gets bred
That's
is such a gross way to phrase that.
it's bread.
And
Wow,
then
that
Bree
is
said, "You're gonna get bread,
oh, okay. Okay.
possibly pumpernickel, possibly a cinnamon roll, something."
Possibly.
So yeah, it was an
Possibly, I'm
long
quite
way
partial
around.
to a Vienna
Innuendo all
loaf.
day. Yeah.
Yeah. And I might link oh, actually, I was in Breeze last night. I was kind of dropping in and out as I was doing some stuff. So, I'll link Breeze because that was actually a lot of fun. Yeah. awesome. We were talking about some kind of alien, three-legged alien, which just all the jokes followed. Really, really good fun. Always down for the cinnamon roll. Yeah, me too. Absolutely. Actually, my wife loves banana bread. She just loves banana bread, and I don't blame her.
I cannot resist pumpkin bread. Bring me pumpkin bread and I will get so fat.
I must admit, I don't eat tons of bread nowadays. I've cut down on my carbohydrate, empty carbs amount, but I certainly do like a nice wrap kind of thing, like a pita bread, or I don't know. Eastern breads are really nice. I don't know what we're doing over in the West. Do you know that bread wouldn't even count as bread from the US? Bread is cake. Basically, it's a form of cake over here because of the amount of sugar in it.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Tomb story is multiply
Let
attested,
them eat cake.
both in Mark's pre-Mark and Passion story and in independent sources. Here, Richard reiterated his point that the Passion story is constructed out of Old Testament motifs, and I think that's simply false. As Joel Green points out, studies of the use of the Old Testament at Qumran among apocalyptists and in post-biblical historiography indicate that biblical texts were adapted to fit events more readily than were events created to fit biblical texts. In other words, in light of the events that had happened, they would go to the Old Testament to look for proof texts for those events. They don't create the events out of the Old Testament texts.
So what you're saying is that they would have events that they wrote down and then go to the Old Testament to fit them to what they wrote down. Okay.
He's saying that the early Christians were cherry picking. They were saying, "Oh, Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, and here's a passage from Isaiah that says the Messiah will do that. So we're going to take that passage and ignore all the rest that says he's going to, drive out the invading armies and become the king above kings.
Yes.
Never mind that. He rode in on a donkey, so that's proof of Jesus. The same as modern apologists do, which, in my opinion, is just actually kind of projection on Craig's part. He's saying, this is what I, as an apologist, do. Therefore, that's what those apologists were also doing.
And I don't know how you can establish that the events were written down and then contrasted against the Old Testament, and people knew the events that were supposedly predicted in the Old Testament and just wrote them down. I don't know how you can sort of distinguish those two from one another. But as you said, they didn't even get all of the events right.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a one or the other thing. Like with most things, there's a little bit of each going on, but
yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, seriously, if Jesus did exist and he was an itinerant rabbi, he would have known about the riding in on a donkey. So what stops him from riding into Jerusalem on a donkey? He was in Jerusalem. He had access to donkeys.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons that apologists' criteria of what counts as prophecy, I think it's number 6, is people weren't actively trying to fulfill a prophecy.
Right. But there were a lot of people claiming to be the Messiah around at the time. That's why Life of Brian by Monty Python was so damn funny, because there was a bunch of people. That guy's line was like, and I say you're the Messiah. I should know. I've followed a few kind of thing. That was hilarious because we know that there were a bunch of people claiming to be this person at the time. So my mind brings up an image of just all these different people in a line behind the gate on donkeys, because that's part of the prophecy. They had to check off every single thing as they came through. But yeah, I mean, Isaiah's famous for making prophecies that don't come true. They just don't work. Like the city of Tyre falling to Nebuchadnezzar. And then because the city didn't fall, which they said it would, they prophesied that Nebuchadnezzar would go north and conquer Egypt, which he didn't do as well. Like, it's just, you know, and the gymnastics that has to be done to get around that failed prophecy is incredible. It's incredible. Them saying, oh, well, no, it was talking about the fortress of Tyre, which did fall to Alexander. It was clearly supposed to be Nebuchadnezzar doing this, and he didn't. Wow.
It's all kinds of goalposts moving in sometimes both directions at once. It's hilarious.
Yeah.
Jesus Tales says Zechariah was the prophecy of the donkey. So
was Zechariah, was it?
Yeah, it very well could be. I could be mixing up my prophecies.
Yeah, but I mean, if I was a religious leader or a itinerant preacher that was in conflict with my mainstream religion, I could get a donkey and ride through the gates of Jerusalem. I could probably organize that today and then claim I was the Messiah. Like, I don't know why you would think, oh, well, that couldn't possibly be done by anybody but the chosen one. How many people rode through donkeys through that gate? That's what I want to know. Like, is maybe one of the other one the Messiah? It's ridiculous.
Moreover, the Passion narrative includes events for which no parallel exists in the Old Testament. For example, the anointing at Bethany, the sword incident at Jesus' arrest, Simon of Cyrene and his 2 sons, the tearing of the temple veil, and so forth. And finally, third, the Passion story did not use obvious motifs from the Old Testament. For example, despite Psalm 22 saying, "They have pierced my hands and feet," the Passion story doesn't say that Jesus was nailed to the cross. For all we know, he could have been tied with ropes. So they didn't use this Old Testament motif from Psalm 22 to create the Passion story.
Plus, Psalms is sort of more poetry. It's more poetic than anything. You know, pierced my hands and feet may be a reference to something else. You know, I don't know. But he's sort of arguing that the inaccuracy of the Passion story grants it credibility. You know, that it doesn't fulfill prophecy. It's makes it more likely.
I mean, I think if a story definitely does not fulfill prophecy, it makes it more likely that the story hasn't been altered to fulfill that specific prophecy.
Right.
Maybe they weren't aware of it. Maybe they were trying to avoid it. Like there's so much, including in Zechariah, about the whole King of Kings will reign over all the nations sort of stuff that was clearly not fulfilled.
Yeah.
And I honestly, I haven't heard a good apologetic for that. Like, oh, well, it's spiritual. Oh, it means after the rapture. Oh, it's later. It's later. They're not fulfilled yet. But the way they're in there and they're not fulfilled, it just, I mean, so I Googled Zechariah real quick.
Okay.
Not because I doubted you, Jesus Tales. I just wanted to see what else he had to say. And some of his main prophecies were that the Messiah would be a descendant of David, that he would die by being pierced for the sins of the people. That's where that business about Jesus died for your sins comes from, because it sure isn't in Matthew's story, you know? And that he would be raised from the dead on the 3rd day, in keeping with all the legends and lore of all the other religions in the area. He would return on the Mount of Olives, and that he would reign in triumph over the whole earth, which, you know, clearly happened. And that he would be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, and that he would ride into Jerusalem on a donkey colt, and the people would be scattered and then gathered in the last days, because he's ruling over the whole world. So it's possible for his people to be scattered, but never mind that.
Right.
Tyre would lose its power over the sea, and the Jewish nation would be restored to global supremacy.
Wait, Tyre's still an important naval port.
Shh.
Okay, sorry.
The prophecy says.
Okay. And so a lot hasn't happened. I guess I want to point out that on one hand, William Lane Craig is arguing that it, like sort of matching up with these prophecies in Zechariah, are evidence that it's true, and it not matching the prophecies in Zechariah is evidence that it's true, right? Like I don't know how you can make those comments one after another. It's just okay. Okay, what the hell?
In any case, I also indicated that there are multiple early sources for the fact of the empty tomb. Matthew uses an independent source, as is evident from the non-Matthean vocabulary in his account.
Does he?
What?
Can we see this source, Bill? Can you show us? I would love to see it.
But wait, you're saying it's evident from the non-Matthean language, so something was added to it? Like, even if he was using a source that was not Matthew, he would still write it in a way that is consistent with the language of that text. He wouldn't write it as if he was somebody else. Like, what are you talking about? What? Is he basically saying Matthew copied Mark? Because we know that already. I am so confused over what he's trying to say.
Yeah.
Like there's language in Mark which doesn't fit with the author. Is that what you're saying? Because that's not a point in your favor, sir. That is not the slam dunk you think it is. But he doesn't say, hey, I talked to this person and got this information. Empty tomb in Matthew.
Yeah, I'm not finding a whole lot.
I don't know exactly what he's talking about, but if he's saying that there's text in Matthew that doesn't seem like it was written by Matthew, that is not the slam dunk that he thinks it is.
I mean, maybe he's trying to imply that the author of Matthew copied and pasted from a other source. But if that were the case, being that these are historical documents with citations,
right,
wouldn't the author of Matthew have said, is it not written, and then include it, you know?
Yeah. And Matthew's the one where the secret meeting between the chief priests and the guards was written down, which Matthew could never have been at, or, you know, we wouldn't expect him to hear about. Interesting.
It's that omniscience effect. It's contagious.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, it's in the extra long ending of Mark. You also gain the omniscience powers of Jesus by worshiping him, because Jesus is everywhere. You know,
it's the power of discernment. It's the power of discernment we keep hearing about.
That's
I don't know where in the Bible that comes from. Where does that come from?
I have no idea.
Where is that in the Bible, the power of discernment? Like, I don't...
We're looking up all kinds of things today.
I mean, Matthew urges people to be discerning and discriminating while remaining non-judgmental, but I don't... Like, where does the power of discernment... Like, what...
Best I've got is Proverbs 2 teaches that true wisdom and discernment comes from God. So built upon that is this doctrinal idea, which is not biblical, that if you have the Holy Spirit, it will occasionally whisper in your ear the real truth behind the obvious evidence.
Superpowers of discernment. It sounds to me, that verse just sounds to me like, hey, everybody's got the ability to discern between right and wrong, or, you know, whether something is true or false. That comes from God, but it's not saying you have any extra power as a Christian to do so. Like, that's not what it says when I hear that. but how it's been explained to me by interesting evangelicals is that they basically have a superpower of discernment.
Found it. 1 Corinthians 2:14. The person without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit, but considers them foolish and cannot understand them because they are discerned only through the Spirit.
Wow. Okay. There you go.
We solved it. You can only understand what the magic ghost says when the magic ghost tells you the thing.
Right. So if you get fooled by a confidence scam, then you're not a real Christian, is what I'm hearing there.
And the fact that he's responding to a pre-Matthean tradition about the empty tomb. John is recognized to be independent of the synoptic gospels. Luke and John have the story of Peter and John visiting the empty tomb, thus indicating an independent tradition of Mark. The sermons in Acts are independent of Mark. And Paul's tradition is pre-Pauline. That's the point that Richard doesn't seem to understand.
Paul doesn't mention the empty tomb.
Uh-huh.
So why is Paul even being brought into this argument for the empty tomb being real? If I was you, Dr. Lane Craig, I would certainly not be bringing up Paul in relation to the empty tomb because he doesn't even mention it. I don't know why you would. It seems like a sort of own goal.
He does that
Just
a lot.
Yeah.
It's irrelevant whether Paul learned things by revelation. What he quotes in 1 Corinthians 15 is a pre-Pauline tradition that goes back within the first few years or even months of the crucifixion. So we have this wealth of multiple independent early attestation in support of the fact of the empty tomb. I mentioned that it was also attested by women witnesses, and Richard didn't respond to that point. Then fourthly, I said it's simple and doesn't show signs of literary embellishment. Here, Richard says, well, yes, it does. It shows the reversal of expectations motif in the Gospel of Mark. I'm sorry, that's simply not true. There is no such reversal of expectation motif in the Gospel of Mark. Rather, as Robert Gundry points out in his commentary on Mark, Mark's gospel is dominated by things happening just as Jesus predicted. It is all about the fulfillment of expectations. The final words spoken at the empty tomb in the Gospel of Mark are just as he told you. So Richard's examples, I think, are just fanciful. They're in his own imagination only. Mark.
Wow, the irony. Can we have some irony in chat? Like Richards are fanciful, their imagination. Now, here's how this guy rose from the dead. I
think Dr. Craig's his power of discernment is broken.
It is broken. Yeah, it's kind of like, yeah, so you basically claiming that this is a narrative story. It's fanciful. It's imagination. Now, here's how a guy rose from the dead. There was an earthquake, an eclipse, and a whole bunch of dead people got out of their graves and walked around a city and was mentioned by one person. I don't know what to say to that. Holy crap. Wow. Because this historical document says it's so. Well, it's a religious text. I'll give you that. But historical document? Wow. The irony is palpable.
Is not about the reversal of expectations, but the fulfillment of expectations. Fifthly, I said that the earliest Jewish polemic presupposes the empty tomb. Richard says, well, Matthew's account of the guard is constructed from the story of Daniel in the lion's den. That's irrelevant. That's wholly beside the point. The point is that what motivated Matthew to either tell or make up his story was that Jews were saying that the disciples had stolen the body. That's what motivated Matthew. And therefore, we have evidence from the early adversaries of.
How does he know what motivated Matthew? Like, has he spoken to Matthew? Was it written by Matthew? So there's a lot of William Lane Craig just stating thing as fact when he actually has no idea whether it is true or not. right? So this whole thing of the motivation of Matthew was that these rumors were going around that the empty tomb, that is not fact. We didn't know if rumors were going around of the guards stealing the body or not. We don't know that, right? Number two, we don't know if it was even Matthew that wrote the thing. Number three, if it was Matthew, we don't know his motivations behind writing that. William Lane Craig is just assuming it to be so because that's the narrative that it has. And that's not how we look at history. We don't just say, well, the author seems to have this intention, so that's what the intention that they had. That's not how we treat history.
Yeah, a lot of Matthew, it's who I think it was Non-Stamp Collector who made a video about why Matthew wrote Matthew, or the person we're calling Matthew anyway. The way he animates it is he's got this early Christian reads through the Gospel of Mark and goes, oh, no, this is completely unbelievable. Here, I'm going to rewrite this and plug some of these larger plot holes because there's shit in here that makes no sense. And that appears to be what's happening. He's throwing in a few extra fantastical flourishes, but a lot of it is just, it has been said that Jesus did it this way, but that doesn't make any damn sense. So it really happened this way,
Yeah. It seems like a retcon to me.
Exactly.
It reads like a retcon.
It's a rewrite. It's The Empire Strikes Back version 2, because Revenge of the Jedi just wasn't a really good movie title.
Mm-hmm.
Christianity, that in fact the tomb was empty. So I think we have very good grounds on all 5 of these lines of support for thinking that in fact the tomb of Jesus was found empty. I then argued that Richard's own attempt to undermine the empty tomb by appeal to Paul is ultimately vain because Paul himself believed in a transformation of the body in the tomb and therefore would believe in the empty tomb.
Except he did
again. Yeah, he's saying Paul would have done this. How do you know that? Paul would have, like, you don't know this person. He didn't discuss it at all. There's nothing that says that he believed in an empty tomb. Like, it's just William Lane Craig going back and saying, hey, because he was a Christian, he would have believed this story, which you don't know that. And you don't know that the story is true. And even if he did believe this story, it doesn't make it true.
And if it were true,
we would see it
Paul wouldn't freaking, if Paul was hearing from the ghost of Jesus and getting the story from the actual Jesus, proof that Jesus really is, a ghosty floating around whispering in people's ear, and the empty tomb were real. If both of those conditions were true, then Paul would have known about the empty tomb, and he did not. So either the ghost of Jesus never told him, he wasn't talking to the real ghost of Jesus, or there was no ghost of Jesus who then never told him.
Yeah.
Thirdly, we talked about the 2 lines of evidence in favor of the appearances, and Richard admits that these occurred. He merely tries to explain them away as hallucinations, and we'll deal with that in a moment. Finally, number 4, the origin of the Christian faith. Again, we saw that what the disciples came to proclaim and believe was completely contrary to Jewish expectations, and therefore requires some sort of radical transformative experience to account for what happened.
Bill, that's exactly what you just said doesn't apply. It's the opposite of what the Jews would expect, but it's not a reversal of expectation.
Right.
Fuck off, Bill.
Yeah, this is what I mean. He'll argue one point to support his claims, and then argue the exact opposite to support his claims. You can't do that. Like, you're negating your own points, Bill. I know. Wow.
Now, given that those are the 4 facts that are accepted by the majority of New Testament scholars today for the reasons that I've laid out, the question then is...
Yeah, but a majority doesn't... That's changed, Bill. We don't force people to believe in this stuff to study it anymore. So Oops.
What is the best explanation of these facts? And here Richard talks about hallucinations occurring, perhaps theft of the body or some such thing. I want to suggest that none of these naturalistic explanations really stack up when they're assessed by the criteria that I mentioned in my first speech. Just look at them. First of all, explanatory scope. The apparent death theory, the theft.
Whoa, what the hell happened there?
Microphone
theory, the wrong tomb theory, only try to explain the empty tomb. The hallucination theory only tries to explain the appearances. No naturalistic theory can explain all four facts before.
Yeah, it can. They made it up. They made all of it up. They made everything up. They were under a delusion.
Which is the actual point. That's why Craig can have all the four facts he wants. The four stories do not match. They are incompatible.
Right. Yeah. It doesn't match. And so, it was a bunch of religious zealots who had delusions of their Jesus rising from the dead. That's it. And then they wrote it down like it's true. And you're saying they're facts. They're not facts. Facts are agreed upon things in the world. They are agreed upon that they did happen. And we're not agreeing on these facts. So they're not facts. The sun sets every day. That's a fact, right? Everybody agrees on it. When we're basically saying, hey, this isn't a fact, then it's not a fact. Like this is a claim. You've got to show that it actually happened.
And as Richard says,
so I feel like he's conflating between something like you and I would consider a fact, right? We'd consider, the sun sets as a fact, it sets in the west. That's a fact, right? With he's trying to conflate this idea of, well, they wrote down this, right? That's a fact, right? That fact they wrote down. But he's trying to sort of work it as, well, it's a fact that it happened. And that's not a fact. No, that's not a fact.
Yeah.
So he's trying to.
We get this from a lot of apologists. They say, well, it's a fact that the gospel says Jesus rose from the dead.
Right.
Okay. And yes, that is a fact. The gospel says that. And then they try to push it the next step and say, therefore, Jesus rose from the dead. No, it's a fact. The gospel says so.
Yeah.
But whether that's true is the reason we're discussing,
And so, them writing that there was an empty tomb doesn't mean there was a fact that there was an empty tomb. And I feel like he's conflating the two things. Like, it has to account for all of these facts. And it's like, well, the delusion accounts for all of the facts if you consider writing it down as the fact. I wrote down there was the Gospels wrote down that there was an empty tomb. Absolutely, that's a fact. But you're taking it as, well, the empty tomb itself is a fact. And it's a little ridiculous. I feel like he's being a little bit disingenuous right now.
In another context, the sign of a good theory is its ability to explain all the data by the same single thesis. So
I don't think that's true.
No, the sign of a good hypothesis is predictive power and testability.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I could come up with something, one single theory that explains all of quantum mechanics. It's magic. It doesn't make it a good theory or a good hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it's terrible.
I'm inclined to think of Newton's gravity. It explained a lot of things very well and fairly simply, but it had some obvious flaws even in Newton's day. It didn't accurately predict Mercury, but it was so damn accurate in most other contexts that people went, it's got flaws, but we'll use it anyway. And likewise, general relativity fixed that problem as well as the starlight deflection problem and a few other problems, but then it runs into issues at the quantum level. And that's why we have, the dust up in modern physics, because quantum theory describes quantum stuff very, very well, but not outside of anything beyond an atomic nucleus. And then general relativity has everything that's like larger than an atom. and they don't really cross over very well. So they're both incomplete, but they're both very, very good at what they do. Nobody's saying, well, that's not a good hypothesis because it doesn't explain the other thing. That's not how we evaluate these things.
And the worst kind of hypothesis is the one with unlimited explanatory scope and no explanatory power, which is what William Lane Craig is putting forward. He is putting forward God did it somehow, right? That it happened somehow. Like if you're explaining why the tomb is empty, saying magic is not a good explanation because it doesn't actually explain how it happened. All you're doing is substituting the power, the explanatory power, how well you explain what happened, with just a mysterious force. That is not, like, if you want to talk about scientific theories, saying that, hey, it was magic that did it, is not a good scientific theory, because while it can explain anything and sort of, make an explanation for anything, its scope is really wide, it doesn't actually explain it. It has no power. And God is the same. How did God do it? We don't know. It's a mystery. God can just do it.
The resurrection hypothesis exceeds these naturalistic theories in explanatory scope. Secondly, explanatory power. No naturalistic theory does a good job of explaining the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection.
Really, what's the explanatory power for God did it? Explain that.
I mean, there's a reason. It's a reason we could articulate. No, so again, this is a very old debate. Dr. Craig doubtless has no idea what's coming when Paulogia decides to tackle this specific issue and say, hey, here's a reasonable explanation. But Paul just formalizes what's really obvious. When you boil it all down, we have one gospel that got copied a whole bunch based on a bunch of wives' tales and oral tradition and whatnot. And on the other side, we have one dude who had a hallucination. So at best, we've got two stories that need to be explained naturalistically. And one of them is several generations down. It's the written version of an oral tradition. So there we have a naturalistic explanation for the one. Why did the oral tradition start? Why did the story begin morphing and changing? Well, there's Paul running around writing letters to all these different groups, telling them to get on the same page with their doctrine and shit. Granted, Paul had to get the idea from somewhere. We know before he converted, he was chasing Christians, but that leaves us with 0 original sources. Oops.
Theft and wrong tomb theories don't explain why the disciples would come to this outlandish and un-Jewish conclusion that God had raised Jesus from the dead. Hallucinations of the dead, however real, don't lead to belief that the person is alive. As NT.
Oh, they absolutely do. What are you talking about? People in grief, especially very deep grief, especially if they have mythology that they're going to come back, can have very vivid and absolutely be deluded into thinking they're alive. Like, I don't know where he gets this idea from, especially if they have a preponderance to believe that kind of thing.
I've heard people have seen Elvis. And lots of people, which is clearly proof that he's risen from the dead. In fact,
but they don't think he's alive, Ember. They don't think he's alive.
They might. We don't know.
William Lane Craig just said, well, they do. That's the thing. They think that Elvis is still alive.
Yeah. And clearly Elvis is Jesus, because they're pulling the same trick. And we know every time Jesus reincarnates, he gets a different face. That's why all these Elvises look just a little bit off. They're not quite like the picture,
Right. Yeah.
It's Jesus has just been doing this. Every time he dies off, he just puts on a new face and carries on. And in the 1970s, he was Elvis. And occasionally he just puts it back,
what I'm hearing is that Jesus was an Elvis impersonator. That's what I'm hearing from all of that, or what I've chosen to hear. But yeah, like his idea that if you have a grief-induced hallucination of a loved one, you can't possibly think they are alive again. I want to know where he's getting that information from.
Yeah, I mean, there's people who aren't having grief-induced hallucinations. I was listening to Julia Sweeney, who she was in the Saturday Night Live cast, but she's been doing like semi-comedic, semi-biographical talks about being
Okay.
a public atheist.
Yeah.
And I was listening to one of those where she was talking about the relevance escapes me. It just boop, it ran away. It may come back to me.
Okay, a grief-induced hallucination.
Right, her mother has dementia and keeps thinking that dead people are still around. Like, granted, she did have grief for those people when they passed, but it's been decades for some of them, and she's just like, she calls up Julia and says things like, "Oh, your father's waiting for me at the bus station. I have to go."
Yeah. Dementia is really sad, though. It's a very, very sad thing.
Wright says in the ancient world, visions of the dead were not taken as evidence that they were alive. They were taken as evidence that they were dead. And besides that, visions of the exalted Jesus would at most have led to the conclusion that he had been assumed into heaven, which is a different category in Jewish doctrine, resurrection from the dead.
Yeah, but it wasn't just visions. Like, Thomas touched the dude. You know what I mean? Like, according to the story. Is that made up? Don't know. Like, you know, that's the whole point behind that story, is that one guy doubted and he had to be convinced, kind of thing. Like, but he's using people's propensity to have visions of the supernatural in that time because they believed in it so fervently as an evidence that it did actually happen. So all of the visions of that time were visions of dead people. It's really weird. Like,
yeah,
I don't.
He's referencing a legendary trope of well, not of that age, but you know, the Greeks did it a lot. I think it's been a while since I read Homer, but I think there's a section in the Iliad where somebody has a vision of their father who is minding the kingdom back home, and because they had the vision, they know the father has passed. His spirit came to me in a dream. I know he is no longer of this world.
Yeah.
And yeah, that was a literary trope in those ages. It still gets referenced in literary works from time to time.
Sure. Yeah.
But that kind of works against his case, though, you know, even if they were legit visions, somehow, for some reason, that would mean Jesus is dead. The same way the kings and the other assorted folks who appear in that kind of trope are actually dead, you know?
Yeah. So I don't know. This is very, very, it's very flimsy as well, kind of thing. Very, very flimsy evidence to me that, hey, tropes exist of dead people, therefore it must have, you know, because he was seen to be alive, then it must have happened. I find that very, very weak source indeed. Because, I mean, even the Greek mythology that people came back from the dead. I mean, look at Oedipus. Was it Orpheus? Sorry, Orpheus and Eurydice. He went and tried to fetch her from the underworld. Hercules went to the underworld. People that went to the Elysium Plains, which was the afterlife for heroes, could actually return to the normal world. It's just none of them wanted to because the place was so great, apparently. But they could return if they wanted to in Greek mythology. So we do have examples of mythology where people returned from the dead. They returned from Hades. So it's, you know, his whole thing of, oh, if they saw somebody, they had to be. No, that's not exclusively the case. So yeah, I don't know why he's just sort of, you know, saying that. Seems to be a blanket statement that really doesn't consider the nuances of sort of afterlife in that section of the world.
I think that maybe one of the ways in which being a student of philosophy rather than of history or religious mythology or whatever may be working against him, because there's a long story to it, but to cut to the chase, the oldest resurrection story that we know of is the goddess Inanna, who went to the underworld and was killed by her sister while she was there, spent 3 days, and then came back to the surface and traded the life of a mortal for her own so that she could resurrect. And that story got copied and pasted by a whole lot of other traditions afterwards.
And it reminds me kind of the Horus myth kind of thing, where Horus dies and is resurrected. So I don't know why you would sort of say, it's very, very strange. It's very strange why you'd sort of say, hey, people that saw any kind of vision or any kind of image of someone that's dead knew they were dead. Can you demonstrate that? Especially considering there's myths around that people did rise from the dead. No, just crickets. Yeah. William Lane Craig at his finest. Oh, discernment. I forgot. It's like a smoke bomb. Discernment.
Yeah. Thirdly, plausibility. The apparent death theory is utterly implausible medically and physically. The pious theft theory is anachronistic in attributing to Jesus' disciples.
Yeah, but the make crap up theory is really plausible. People have been making crap up for a long time, William Lane Craig. Like, you kind of sort of say, hey, let's go into plausibility. Let's take one extreme thing. It was the swoon theory, which I think is total nonsense kind of thing. Like, I don't think swoon theory is worth it. I think that swoon theory was made up by sort of theists as a straw man, to be honest with you. I don't think anybody thinks that Jesus just was a real person and he just happened to faint and they thought he was dead, even though they crucified him and stuck a spear in his side. I don't.
Yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on a lot of these things. I reviewed another person from Premier Unbelievable who made a list of how do we know Jesus rose from the dead, and she runs down this list of things that people say to explain away the empty tomb. And when I covered that video, I'm like, this is nothing so much but a list of straw men. The true goal is to try to paint the picture that people actually accept there was an empty tomb implicitly.
Right.
And I'm like, no. I mean, we see it in Matthew when he talks about, some people may say that they stole the body or they paid the guards or whatever else.
Yeah.
No one said that, though. That's a thing that Matthew put in there because it's just like with any conspiracy theory. If you're fighting about the shape of the earth, you're not fighting about the Bible. If you're fighting about whether the body was stolen, you're not fighting about whether there even is an empty tomb.
Right.
Motive to either fake his assumption or resurrection. And the followers of no messianic movement through the first century before Jesus through the first century after Jesus ever did or claimed such a thing about their executed would-be Messiah. The wrong tomb or
what? We just went into the horror story. What?
That's an interesting idea, though. What if those silly women who went to the tomb with the spices and whatnot, they go and they're like, hey, wasn't this tomb sealed? Well, now the door's been moved over, and how were they going to move the stone door in the first place? But never mind that. They get there and they say, the door is open. And they go inside and they go, there's no body in here. And all the time they just went to the wrong fucking tomb.
Maybe. That, then you've got to explain why the guards are there kind of thing. Maybe they didn't want
that's why they had to add the guards after.
Yeah, maybe.
Relocation theories are implausible because once the disciples began to preach Jesus' resurrection, the Jewish leadership would have been only too glad to point out the disciples' stupid error in going to the wrong place.
Sorry.
The hallucination theory is implausible in trying to psychoanalyze past historical figures. You can't do that, and that's why psychobiography is a failed genre.
What?
What are we even talking about?
We said you can't psychoanalyze past historical figures, but you've been telling us their motivations and what you just said. Paul thought this. Like, what do you... that is really bad. Paul would have believed the empty tomb story. That's psychoanalyzing a historical figure. What?
Remember, folks, Craig is the best they've got.
Yeah. We shouldn't psychoanalyze historical figures, but Paul thought this, and the disciples intended that. Wow. I mean, William Lane Craig, this has really dropped my respect for the man, seriously. Not that I had a huge amount from Low Bar Bill, but wow.
Of historical writing. Thus, Richard calls Paul a happy schizoid in his work, and he calls Mary a psychotic. You can't do that responsibly. You can't do psychoanalysis on historical figures. Besides, the diversity and the number of the experiences.
But you are. You're basically considering them sane, reasonable, rational, and stable, just out of hand. And then assigning motivations to them, assigning intentions to them, and assigning all kinds of stuff to these people without knowing anything about them, or if it was even them that wrote the books. Like, don't forget that. Don't forget these Gospels. The only one we're sure of is that Paul wrote the stuff attributed to Paul, and not even all of it. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we do not know that they wrote those. We don't know that. So he is psychoanalyzing people, even though he doesn't know they were the ones that wrote the book. And then says to Carrier, how dare you psychoanalyze these historical figures? Wow, dude, what the hell?
Experiences outstrip anything in the psychological case books. Number 4, the theory must not be ad hoc. The Wicked Witch theory that Richard has propagated is ad hoc because there's no evidence whatsoever, literary or archaeological, of the use of human body parts in healing or necromancy in first century Israel. To postulate such practices in Judea, and especially Jerusalem, is completely ad hoc. Now, I could go on, but the point is that on virtually every count, naturalistic theories are inferior to the resurrection hypothesis. Look, in all honesty, I think that we have to...
What? No, they're always superior. Naturalistic explanation. We agree naturalistic things happen. What we don't agree is that supernatural things happen. But again, I want to sort of say, you can apply this to other texts like the Bhagavad Gita, right? The Hindu texts or the Quran or anything like that, and say, hey, a supernatural explanation is superior. And William Lane Craig will go, no, a naturalistic explanation is superior for those texts because they're not his religion. This is only for his religion, which is sort of really telling.
Yeah, I mean, Craig positing that Joseph Smith's account of wooden submarines in the Bronze Age as being entirely, after the fact mythological is totally post hoc, because everyone knows that there weren't submarines when Joseph Smith was translating the tablets. So how did he know if not for magical prophecy powers?
Right. Insane.
Say the only reason the skeptic rejects the resurrection hypothesis is because of his aversion to miracles. But if God exists, as my argument presupposes...
I'm sorry. The only reason we reject it is an aversion to miracles. Do you have a miracle to show me?
Well, he's presupposing one.
Yep. And
sort of,
I could say the same. Like, you only don't believe the Quran because of your aversion to Islamic miracles.
Yeah, you're biased against them, Mark. But you know what would be a miracle? If, despite all its flaws, Craig's argument actually convinced us. It'd be fucking miraculous. It would require
That
the
would be a
Holy
miracle.
Ghost to float into my ear and start driving my body like a meat robot.
Yeah,
Miracle.
I think for this to be rationally convincing, it would be a fucking miracle, quite frankly. Wow.
Then how can you say justifiably that it's improbable that God would raise Jesus from the dead? The real question is this then: how open are you to the existence of God?
Whether we believe it or not should not be based upon how credulous you are. That's a lousy criteria for epistemology. Is, well, how credulous are you? How much do you believe stuff that hasn't been demonstrated? That is not a criteria. We should be looking at more objective criteria than that. Wow. And like I said at the start, this is not to convince people it happened. This is to give reasons for people that already believe to keep believing. That's what it is.
A doctorate level philosopher who believes you ought to set reason aside and just accept things. A doctorate level philosopher who is actively campaigning against sound epistemology.
Yeah. Incredible.
Can you have a doctorate revoked?
I wish. Wouldn't it be funny if Kent Hovind had his doctorate revoked? That would be hilarious.
From Patriot Bible.
You're bringing disrepute to our paper mill.
I'd love it.
Yeah, I would love that. Can we write maybe?
I bet if we sent them another $75, they might do that.
Maybe. Send them 150, double it, and they'll probably do it. That would make me so happy. I would be so pleased.
Well, that was an enormous shotgun of arguments, I must say. There's no way
it was.
Them all.
It
so
was, yes.
To the chase of the important items that were brought up. The first item is that he ended there with the argument that I reject the resurrection because I reject miracles. That actually isn't the case I'm making today. The case that I'm making today is most bodies that go missing don't go missing because of miracles. Most dead people and most gods are seen through hallucinations. Therefore, the presupposition must be that even the conjunction of these two causes is more naturalistically common than the supernatural alternative, even if there are miraculous cases of this, even if there are miraculous missing bodies, even if there are miraculous appearances of resurrected people. Most resurrection claims do not involve actual resurrections, and there are.
Yeah, so I abductive arguments, so probabilistic arguments, they don't sell me. I don't find them that compelling. I got to be honest with you, because they don't actually get at whether we should believe it or not. There's been things that are incredibly improbable that have actually happened. So I find them to be, while when mixed with something else that is inductive or deductive, I think they're good supporting evidence, but I don't find them particularly compelling. I think maybe this is an inductive thing. Like, there's all of these resurrection claims and they turn out to be false. So why would we assume that, the miracle actually happened as opposed to another false thing? Maybe he's angling for that. Do you think?
I think he's more just like getting Craig's silly argument off the table by saying he says that I'm against miracles. Well, no, not really. I can allow miracles in this case and still say you've got to demonstrate this was one, though.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good point. Like, Craig's trying to shift the burden of proof to say, hey, prove it wasn't a miracle. And that is kind of a weird thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Dozens and dozens of resurrection claims in the ancient world like this. So the same thing would have to be argued, that we should prefer naturalistic explanations until we can rule them out, and we don't have sufficient evidence to rule them out. Now, another thing he pointed out was, why resurrection? Why would they believe that Jesus was raised from the dead? Well, one reason is that the conjunction of items in Scripture, Daniel, Isaiah, the wisdom of Solomon, all create this character of the Messiah who's going to be executed. They can see it. Daniel says, the Messiah shall be executed, yet there's no judgment upon him. Isaiah speaks of a similar innocent man who will be executed, even though there's no judgment upon him. And this man will die for the sins of Israel, and then God will exalt him, and his days will be prolonged, and he'll be executed despite. The Wisdom of Solomon has a similar thing, where he'll be resurrected, and he'll be rewarded for being executed with resurrection. And we also have a recent inscription found with the Apocalypse of Gabriel, which says that the Messiah will be resurrected on the third day. So exactly as Paul says. So here we have a conjunction of scriptural passages that could have inspired the Christians to actually come to this belief. When their Messiah died, when their holy man died, Jesus, they would be looking for any explanation for why that happened, how that could actually be part of God's plan. And they would pour through the scriptures. And Paul says that's where they found these things. In Romans 16, verse 25 to 26, he talks about how there were hidden messages in scripture that they were finding that were communicating to them aspects of the gospel. So they were.
What was that? That was Romans 15?
I think that's what he said. While you're working on that, it's also worth mentioning that while we were talking earlier about the 3 days to resurrection thing is a common thing in a lot of religions and myths, especially around that area, especially around that time. The whole an innocent person must be sacrificed thing, that isn't just a callback to earlier Bible texts like the abortive sacrifice of Isaac earlier. That's also the Jewish religious tradition, the tradition of the scapegoat. Is it wasn't you just put all the sins of Israel on the goat that you drive off into the desert. You bring two goats. The one that has all the sins gets driven off, but the innocent one then gets sacrificed for God's glory. So that's what that's referencing. And that's why there needs to be that other character on the cross who gets all the sins placed upon him and driven away. They're trying to make Jesus into both. He takes all the sins and he's the sacrifice. But that's why there's that son of the father character, is he's the actual criminal and he's released and driven off, whereas Jesus, so that Jesus can be the innocent one.
Right.
It's Yom Kippur recapitulated.
And yeah, he's right. In Romans 15, it sort of talks about, as it is written, therefore I'll praise you among Gentiles, I'll sing the praise of your name, rejoice you Gentiles with his people. And again, praise the Lord, all you Gentiles, let the peoples extol him. And again, Isaiah says, the root of Jesse will spring up, the one who will arise to rule over the nations. In him the Gentiles will hope. But, you know, it's very odd that sort of that they're sort of talking about this as, you know, he will rise to rule over nations. Well, he didn't, except if you count Vatican City, which isn't really a nation. I mean, it's just a city.
Well, soon to be the United States, apparently.
Well, you know, but
I mean,
that,
granted,
that
that's
is people
a certain
working
flavor of
towards
Jesus.
it.
Yeah.
It's not really prophecy if people are working to fulfill it. That was the whole point that was made with the, you know, sort of the destruction of Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the Second Temple. It's not really prophecy if people are working towards making it happen. So yeah, it's very, very odd.
What? Okay, so Beck in the chat, Majestic Beck says, would have been a better story if Jesus was an identical twin. You're right. But also, what if he was? What if he secretly did have a twin? They killed the one Jesus, and then there's another Jesus walking around. Holy shit, it's a miracle. Or, like a soap opera, he has a twin.
Well, that would have been dramatic. But if Jesus did have a twin, why would you just not use the twin after the crucifixion? Why would nobody recognize you? Because if it was a twin, people would probably go, hey, that's
maybe
Jesus.
That's why they put that bit in the story about, oh, no one recognized him, he had a totally different face, because there actually was a twin and they needed to like distance I'm conspiracy theorizing.
That is huge.
I am literally just making this shit up.
The conjecture is just off the chain.
Scripture for these very things. Now, Paul calls the resurrection of Jesus the first fruits of the general resurrection. And he repeatedly says, of course, in his letters, that the end of the world is coming soon. So imagining the resurrection of Jesus seems to have been the cult's way of proving to themselves that God had sent a decisive sign the end was nigh. the resurrection of Jesus meant the end of the world was coming. It was the beginning of the general resurrection. So because they believed the end of the world was coming, presumably because Jesus taught this, which is entirely possible.
Yeah, even according to the Bible, Jesus thought that the end was coming during people's lifetimes. Absolutely thought that. So, you know, like
or at
we've
least,
got,
or at least the followers who put words in Jesus' mouth, who wrote down what he supposedly said, filtered through their perceptions and oral tradition, thought that Jesus thought the end of the world was coming.
Well, we've got to remember that early Christianity was a doomsday cult. It was a doomsday prediction. All of sort of Revelations and things was this whole thing that the world would be destroyed. And what's interesting about it is not only does Jesus say that, you know, or allegedly, according to his followers, say that, hey, you know, all of this will come to pass before some of you have tasted death. So this will be happening in your lifetime. All of this stuff, the kingdom of God will be established within your lifetime. The Revelations, while they love to point and say, oh, well, the Euphrates River is drying up, and that was prophesied in Revelation, so we know that that's part of the end times kind of thing. There's a whole bunch of stuff about people marching with swords and shields, right? Like it was supposed to be within their lifetime that they make things of chariots going, and, you know, people clashing with swords and spears. And it's just sort of like, well, this is obviously supposed to be in their day, which, you know, I don't know if you know this, didn't, you know, the world didn't end circa 100 CE.
I mean, it might have, and we just, I mean, maybe it's like the global flood. It happened and just nobody wrote it down at the time. Sure, why not? But that isn't the only failed prophecy of Jesus. I mean, they talk about how even in Mark, he talks supposedly prophesies the destruction of the second temple, like immediately after his own death, and it waits, you know, another couple generations until around 70 CE. But in the prophecy, assuming it is about the temple, he says that no stone will be left atop another. And there's a bunch of, you know, hermeneutical excuses about this, you know, oh, they burned the temple and gold melted and it flowed under the stone, so the Romans pried up the stones to get to the gold, and that's why no stone was left atop each other, except there are still stones atop each other. The Western Wall is kind of a monument. There's a whole fucking wall that's still intact.
They were primed to believe Jesus had been raised, as Scripture in fact promised of God's chosen. Now, that's entirely plausible. We don't have enough evidence to confirm any particular theories or to refute any particular theories. It's not ad hoc because it's an actual, natural, plausible hypothesis, and we don't have any further evidence to rely on to actually build what caused these particular visions and what caused this particular message, what caused them to find a particular message in the Old Testament. All religions are unique in their own way, informing their point of view. Now, with regard to the empty tomb, Dr. Craig briefly mentioned at one point that the majority of scholars accept the empty tomb. That's actually not true. I assume this is based on Gary Habermas's article in the Journal of the Study of Historical Jesus in June.
Gary frigging Habermas. What a absolute fraud that guy is. Seriously. Habermas is terrible. He is absolutely terrible. I don't. Is he even a historian? I don't think he is.
Somebody told us in a comment on part 1 that his degree is in interdisciplinary studies, I believe.
Yes. Yeah. He's a theologian, and you know, he's done scholarship on the Bible. Don't get me wrong. It's just, you know, he's not a historian, but he'll talk a lot about.
He pretends to be. I mean, he's writing like 3 volumes that are 1,000 pages each. That's another of Paul Agea's interesting projects is whenever Habermas comes out with a new book, Paul will go through it and then do like a detailed response, just dissecting all of it. It's amazing.
That's
but
awesome.
I've never been able to take Habermas seriously.
No, neither have I.
Not just because of his really silly minimal facts argument, but what really got me is he did an interview with Capturing Christianity when that channel was still fairly new. And Cam, the host of Capturing Christianity, talks to him about the Shroud of Turin, which is one of his hobby horses.
Yeah.
And he says, as a historian, what do you figure the probability that the Shroud of Turin is genuine? Now, we know that it's been known to be a fraud since the beginning because there's a fucking letter saying so, but Habermas goes, I put it at 50, maybe 80%, depending on what kind of mood I'm in. Is that how we evaluate historical evidence? Is what kind of mood I'm in?
Yeah, that's ridiculous. I think that, plus even the question as a historian, because he's not a historian, you know, he's a theologian. That's two very different things. People that study religions and people that study history. Two very different things. Freaking Habermas.
In 2005, where Habermas made the claim that 75% of scholars accept the empty tomb. That's actually not a very high percent as far as consensus goes. 25% of scholars would be actually a sizable minority objection. But in fact, that's not what Habermas measured. He measured 75% of authors who've published for or against the empty tomb. Those who understand statistics might know what's going on with that number. No control for publication bias. If believers are publishing more articles defending the empty tomb, then the percentages will be skewed. There's also a small sample size, only 37 authors who publish on this subject. He also
so if you know anything about statistics, a small sample size is destructive to it, right? So it's one of the things that people will trot out. Like if I flip a coin 5 times and get 3 heads, then there's a 3 in 5 chance of getting a head. That is not accurate. You need probably about 300 as a sample size minimum to get anything even closely resembling accurate statistics. So 35, like almost 1/10 of that, is just insufficient for anything to be statistically significant. It just is. That is ridiculous. 35, no.
also excluded agnostics. So all the scholars who aren't sure whether the empty tomb is a yes or no on that are not counted in his percentage. And if you include agnostics, the percentage would probably go way down, so that in fact we have no consensus in the scholarly community as to whether there was an empty tomb. Now that's that point. Now, there's tons of other things that Dr. Craig has said.
Really? Habermas? P-hacking? Never would have thought. If you're unaware what p-hacking is, so the p-value is probability in statistics. It's basically your p-value, like for instance, you flip a coin, the p-value for heads is just under 0.5, right? That 0.5 is the p-value of 50-50. It's slightly under that, apparently, because of the weight of the coin that is used. Depending on which side has weight, it'll be slightly, but it's about 0.5, like just close enough. So p-hacking is basically, things like Habermas excluding agnostic, like we don't know if it's, empty or not, or the empty tomb existed or not, excluding values, using lurking variables to change that number, to get that number to where you want it to be. And it's a big problem in statistics, huge problem in statistics, because what you're supposed to do is account for all variables, try and make it as even as possible, make sure your sample is taken across the range as much as possible. Like you're supposed to, have that as objective as possible. And unfortunately, a lot of statistics are p-hacked. They're basically just their methodology changes so they get the result you want, which is a big problem.
Now, I don't think, he says that I'm just seeing things in the Gospels when I point out all of the things I pointed out to you. I think it would be a remarkable coincidence for all of those literary devices to be in there just by accident, or that the entire structure of these stories just happened to correspond to history. For example, Barabbas is actually a very unusual name. It's an odd name. And definitely the fact, even if it wasn't an odd name, the fact that it's in that story and exactly where it would have that particular meaning of a parallel between 2 sons of the Father in a story that exactly mimics the atonement ceremony of the temple ceremony of the temple Jews, that exactly fits the gospel message that Christ is the atoning sacrifice that is dying for the sins of Israel. All of that, that to me seems quite plainly to be myth. And all the other examples I gave you are quite plainly myth. And most historians, when they see things like this, they agree. And I listed several biblical scholars who agree with me on this. And he says they don't, but in fact, there were many who do. Now, he also cites the street sermons in Acts. Now, it was actually tradition in ancient historiography to make up speeches. In fact, we have historians who actually tell us, we don't really know, we don't have stenographers who are taking these speeches down, so we have to make them up based on what we think the speaker said. The author of Acts, of course, is therefore fabricating these speeches to suit his case, and that's actually very common and commonly accepted in ancient history. We understand this is the case. Now,
and Carrier is a historian. He is. That's his discipline, isn't it? Like Carrier is a a historian of a sort of ancient Middle East kind of thing. I'll just look up what his actual credentials are, but I think that he's kind of I don't know. It's very, very interesting.
Yeah, I always thought he was
Yeah, PhD in ancient history. Yeah.
and he's got a double master's in ancient history and a master of philosophy in ancient
Mhm.
history.
Yeah.
He mentions that the empty tomb is implied in 1 Corinthians 15, but the fact is, Paul doesn't say the tomb was found empty by anyone. He only says that people saw Jesus. And we don't really know what evidence they actually had that the tomb was empty, or even if they believe they did. He also says that women can't serve as witnesses in a Jewish court of law. That's actually completely false. In my book, Not the Impossible Faith, I conclusively demonstrate that they were in fact widely accepted as witnesses in Jewish courts and in Roman courts and in Greek courts, and that they were even used as sources for historical information. There wasn't anything intrinsically embarrassing about having a woman as a witness. But
Oops. Looks like things changed from the Old Testament thing that women couldn't be witnesses. Whoops.
Yeah, I mean, sort of like a bunch of other things. Like in the Old Testament, you had to make your sacrifices at the tent of meeting or when they built it, the first temple. This idea of doing your sacrifices with any random priest who happens to have a portable altar, that was a modern convenience, but it was extra biblical. It was a thing that changed. It seems a lot like later European sexist sensibilities got superimposed on. We don't take women seriously. We wouldn't believe a woman's word as a witness. So clearly they didn't either.
Well, I mean, and women in culture haven't, especially ancient culture, didn't fare very well, but there was certain rights that they did have, like, sort of in Roman society, for instance, they certainly weren't seen as the equal of men, but they did have certain rights. And one of those was to, have their word taken and things like that. So, I think that, I don't know. I would trust Dr. Carrier, a professor and a doctor of ancient history, over, a doctor of philosophy any day of the week, because that's what he does. I don't know. It was the criteria for embarrassment, I believe, that they sort of allude to. The women couldn't testify, so why make them the witnesses?
That's one of the that's why they make a big deal over the fact that it was embarrassing that it was women, because of the criterion of embarrassment, as if that were in any way valid. If one were going to fabricate a story, you would include details that would seem to be embarrassing to make it seem more believable.
Yeah, absolutely.
In fact, the women are not there to provide testimony to the tomb, because
that's like saying, a dog must have really ate your homework because it's kind of embarrassing that a dog would eat your homework. Like, I don't, it's just a ridiculous concept. Like, you were late for work. Oh, well, you must have broken down because breaking down is embarrassing. That's not always the case. Some people make up that stuff even though it is embarrassing. And sometimes because it is embarrassing, because it's more believable. So yeah, it's not an argument.
This is symbolic fiction. The women are there to symbolize something. There are many things they symbolize in this story. I mentioned one, that they are the least who are the first. It exactly represents that. It also fits the fact that Mark builds his empty tomb narrative using one exact phrase and other concepts from the Jacob's Well narrative in Gospel and Genesis, where we also have women involved asking the same question: who will move the stone for us? Using the exact same phrase, and also it's a woman speaking. There's many reasons why he would do this. Another reason he would do this is that he's creating more irony from the front to the back of his gospel. Mark has his story end with the implausible remark that the women fled the empty tomb in fear and silence, telling no one anything, despite having been told to deliver a message. But this exactly reverses the beginning of Mark's gospel, which speaks of the good news of the voice crying out, of the messenger who will prepare our way, who was a man, incidentally. So Mark even frames his entire gospel with irony, using the women, which means he has to put women here if he's going to create that irony in that story, because the men, of course, saw Jesus and were preaching Jesus, so they can't have told nothing to no one.
Chekhov's
complete narrative,
witnesses.
Yeah, Chekhov's witnesses. Yeah, yeah. Have you had witnesses in the start? They must tell somebody by the end. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
had to put women in his empty tomb story. Women also fit his gospel lesson that the least shall be first, and are easily inspired by his analogy with Jacob's well. Now, he says the empty tomb story is uncolored by theological motifs. I don't think that's relevant. It's not necessary that when Mark is constructing this symbolic myth that he would put any particular motifs in there, except the ones he wanted to put in there. He also refers to early Jewish polemic in Matthew. In fact, we have no Jewish sources that refer to this polemic. This is entirely first appears in Matthew. Matthew, it's not even in Acts, which is pretty much, to me, decisively confirms that the Jews were not accusing Christians of having stolen the body. If they were doing that, the book of Acts would show this as a fundamental component of the story of the early church.
Right.
The Christians would actually have been accused of stealing the body. They would have been brought in an inquiry. They would have been tried for this crime, even if they were let off. So we don't have any example of the authorities showing any interest in this accusation of theft or making this accusation of theft, even though the Jews brought the Christians in to court many times to try to try them and try to get them convicted of things. This accusation never appears. So Matthew is making this up. And I think he's making it up, as I said, in order to emulate Daniel and the lions. Then it's all a part of his story. And I talk more in Empty Tomb about what the actual motives were and what actual message he was creating with that. I won't address the particular arguments that he raised regarding whether Jesus switched bodies. If you're actually interested in that argument, my Empty Tomb book actually covers it in great detail, and you'll see that some of his arguments don't actually necessarily refute what I'm talking about. My actual argument here today is that we don't actually know what happened to the body or what the original Christians believed about that body. We don't have any reliable evidence for that. The Gospels I don't trust at all, and the epistles don't talk about the missing body or who actually went to the tomb or if anyone did.
Yeah, and I want to just point out just quickly how hard it is to deal with scattershot, because he pointed it out. Like William Lane Craig was just scattering tons of arguments, just argument after argument. If he wasn't making notes, there is no possible way he could keep up with every argument. No possible way. There were so many of them. And I just want to sort of say how hard it is to deal with that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a variant of the Gish Gallop. Although I noticed that Craig repeatedly pointed out, oh, well, Carrier never addressed this. Carrier never addressed this. Yes. Carrier could be doing the same thing and saying Craig didn't address this or this or this or this.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, Carrier not addressing it, it may not be because he doesn't have an answer to it. It may be because he doesn't have the time. Because Brandolini's law basically says that you can throw out a ton of stuff and they might not be able to address it, kind of thing. So he might be focusing on the pertinent points. And this is something that's done in Gish Gallop. It's what Gish Gallop is intended to do, and Scattershot is intended to do. It's intended to throw out that many arguments you can't possibly address them all. So take that comment of, oh, he hasn't addressed this or that with a grain of salt. But it's more telling when you only throw out 2 or 3 arguments and one of them's not addressed, rather than, I mean, I couldn't even count how many William Lane Craig has thrown out there. I don't think I could count.
All right, what else do we have here that is actually relevant to what I'm talking about? I gave many examples in the Gospel of Mark of reversal of expectation, so I don't think I'm seeing things there. You can judge for yourselves whether those things represent what I'm talking about. You don't need to take his word for it or any other particular scholar's word for it.
Actually, William Lane Craig followed up that denial of reversible expectations by describing a reversal of expectation. So I think that William Lane Craig kind of sees them as well. You know, the Jewish people didn't expect Jesus to have it. You just said that didn't happen. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
And then he asks that he says that radical transformative experience is needed. I'm saying there was one. There was a hallucination, exactly like you have other cults when they're facing failure. They have revelations, experiences that tell them how to move on, how to reinterpret what has happened to them. And I'm arguing that this is what happened in this case. And we don't really have any way to disprove that because we don't have any really good evidence as to what was actually going on in the original church. And he argues that no naturalistic theory can explain all the facts. Well, it's not necessary for one particular cause to explain all the facts. If we have multiple causes, that actually happens as well. Very many historical events are the result of multiple causes going together. But again, we don't even know if there were multiple causes in this case because we don't know what happened to the body. He also says you can't do psychoanalysis on historical figures. I'm not doing a psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is a Freudian thing. I'm talking about actual established cognitive science that we know today, about schizotypal personalities, about the anthropology of actual religious movements and visionary movements. This is something that we know in our background knowledge is common and typical. And what I'm saying is we should go with what's common and typical until we have evidence confirming the contrary. We don't have adequate evidence to confirm the contrary in this case.
Yeah, I kind of think, though, you know, I would rather him say sort of, we don't know if they were schizotypal or in some way deluded about what they saw. We don't know. I get what he's saying, like it is a possibility. I don't think that just raising the possibility is psychoanalyzing the individuals in question. I think just raising the possibility is enough, because William Lane Craig's going, well, the natural explanations don't cover it. But I think that sort of, you know, these mental illnesses and combined with cult behavior can adequately explain everything, you know, absolutely explain everything. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't think he is psychoanalyzing either. I really don't.
Now, I've listed again, many scholars, the ones I named, actually agree with me on this idea that the Gospels are myth. So this is not a radical or fringe idea. There's a lot of mythology in there. They only debate as to what history you can extract from them. And I'm saying in this case, we can't extract any particular history from them. And I'll stop with that.
I got to say, William Lane Craig is a much better speaker. Like, he is a better speaker kind of thing. You know, and I don't blame Carrier for that. He's not an apologist. He's a historian. You know, I wouldn't expect him to be huge on public speaking, but you know, obviously William Lane Craig, he's a lot older. He's been doing this forever. He's a lot more practiced. He's a lot more fluid in how he presents. That doesn't make him right. It just means that he's better at presenting arguments on a stage, which I don't hold against Carrier. It's not his job to. But it really does show you how long William Lane Craig has been at this.
Well, it's still true even today. You know, Carrier's got a bit more showmanship in his more recent stuff, but he's still very much on the order of, here are the facts. A reasonable person will conclude from the facts that reasonable things are reasonable. Not a great reach, but no big sales pitch either. Just here's some facts, you know? Whereas, you know, Craig has always been much more heavily on the charismatic persuasion side. Like, well, it may be true that this used Volkswagen has been in multiple fatal accidents over the years, but the fact that it still runs means you can trust it more than the other cars actually.
Right. You know? I really think that he is a lot more practiced, and that, you know, is that a problem with apologists versus, you know, people on the skeptic side? Do we not have enough showmanship in what we do? Is that a question that we need to address? Do we need to entertain and sort of, you know, ought we do the kind of rhetoric that apologists do? I mean, that's a question I've asked myself many times.
It's a balancing act. I mean, there is something to be said for persuasiveness, because sometimes, you know, it is a fallacy to arrive at the right answer for the wrong reason, then you can be persuaded away from the correct answer.
Right.
It's an issue. But on the flip side, there is something to be said for the engagement you can get. If people aren't even listening to your message, it doesn't matter how accurate you are.
But that's like, you know, should the representative for the Democrats lie through their ass like Trump does in order to combat Trump? You know, it comes down to that. Do we want to sink to their level? And I automatically go, no, I don't want to, you know, just do showmanship, rhetoric, and, you know, sophistry in order to convince people of something. I don't want to do that. But at the same time, you know, it seems to be working apparently because Trump's in government kind of thing.
I mean, it does. You do get a lot more charlatans on the charlatan side. That's the nature of the thing. But people like Seth Andrews prove that you don't have to. You can present a show as well as reality. You can have both. It just takes more effort and more practice.
Yep. No, that's fair. Absolutely. All right, Billy, what you got? This is conclusion?
No, the conclusion statements are 5 minutes each, so that'll be 10 minutes before, because the video ends like right at the end of Carrier's wrap up.
Let's review those 4 facts that I said are established by the majority of New Testament
are they
scholars today.
facts?
First,
4.
Jesus' burial in the tomb by Joseph of Arimathea. Richard,
is that a fact? No, it's not. Not everybody agrees on it. It is not a fact. We agree that the book says that Joseph of Arimathea buried Jesus in a tomb. That is not a fact. But he's using it as a fact, and it's not. Right? So that's number 1, is not a fact.
Never disputed that tonight, and yet that is extremely important because the belief in Jesus' resurrection could never have arisen in Jerusalem in the face of an occupied tomb. What about the evidence for the...
That's not factual either. Like, most people didn't go and look at the tomb. You will agree with that. If somebody said, hey, the tomb's empty, people weren't going to check it because there was a boulder over it and guards in front of it. No one was checking that shit. So that's not, you're assuming that as well. I don't think that's a fact.
Empty tomb. First of all, I mentioned the burial account supports it, and Richard doesn't deny it. Secondly, I said that the empty tomb is multiply attested in early independent sources. Richard asserted that the Passion story was constructed out of Old Testament text, but I showed, in fact, from Qumran, apocalypticism, and post-biblical historiography that doesn't happen, that there are many events in the Passion story for which no parallels exist in the Old Testament, and on the other hand, there are obvious things in the Old Testament that weren't picked up in the Passion story. Now, what Richard says here is, well, in Acts, the author simply makes up these speeches. Well, that doesn't work in the case of Acts, because Acts is filled with non-Lucan Semitisms, traces of early Aramaic speech on the part of the disciples. And this has suggested to a good number of scholars that what we have preserved here are independent traditions that Luke had of the early apostolic sermons, and they refer to the empty tomb. So I don't think we've seen any grounds for thinking that the empty tomb is not, in fact, multiply and independently attested, which gives us good grounds for believing in it historically. I suggested, thirdly, that the women witnesses lend credibility to the empty tomb story. And here Richard says, oh, but women did serve as witnesses in Jewish courts of law. What he's talking about is passages from the Mishnah, which is 200 years after the time of the gospel events. Moreover, when you look at these passages, what you find out that women can serve as witnesses on is only 2 things. They can only serve to witness in court to 2 things. First, they can testify to their virginity when they were married, in case their husband accuses them they weren't a virgin. Secondly, a woman can testify that her husband is dead so that she can prove that she's a widow. That's all they can do. I think that serves to emphasize the point that I'm making, that the testimony of women just wasn't regarded on a par with men's. In any case, what Josephus said probably represented the general prejudice of his time, that women were too lightheaded and brash to serve as credible witnesses. Now, Richard says, but look, Josephus relied on the testimony of women in 2 cases in his work. Yes, precisely because no male witnesses were available. He's talking about...
Were there any male witnesses available for the empty tomb?
Well, that's an interesting thing, because some gospels say yes. Mark says no. The women left and told no one. But in John, the women who find the empty tomb immediately go get the men, almost as if trying to answer that specific criticism. It doesn't matter if it's just the women, because they got the men, and the men ran. They had a fucking foot race to get there to go see for themselves. So
the testimony of women who were the only survivors of the slaughters at Gamala and Masada. And this actually goes to prove my point. This is the only place in the corpus of Josephus where he uses women witnesses. And why does he do so here? Because there were no male witnesses. They were the only survivors of the slaughters. The fact that the women are witnesses shows that Josephus isn't making this up, but he is relying on what witnesses he had. And the gospel writers find themselves in exactly the same situation. He says, well, then I mentioned that the gospel accounts of the empty tomb are simple and untouched by legendary or theological embellishment. And he says, yes, they are. Look at the coincidences of the people's names, for example. Well, here I think Richard's speculations just go off the rails. He says that the two Marys at the empty tomb are symbols. Now, understand that 1 out of every 4 women at that time was named Mary. This was a very common name. But Richard says that Mary is like Miriam, and she was the sister of Moses, who was the leader of Israel. So Mary is a symbol for Israel, the promised land. And Mary Magdalene, he says, was from Magdala.
When did he say this? Is this something out of one of his books? Because I don't remember this in the debate at all. Is William Lane Craig going to stuff that he'd written in his books instead of addressing the arguments in the debate? Because that sounds really dodgy to me. Like, if you can't address the arguments he's brought up in the debate and have to go to other stuff, it's very, very strange. Why don't you address his arguments he's brought up today?
Yeah, that's as I understand it, that's the whole point of doing a structured debate. Is you have to introduce, you have to lay out your pieces in your opening, and then in your rebuttal you deal with the other guy's pieces, and you have to stick to the pieces. The only time you bring in other stuff is when it's directly relevant.
Well, maybe he thinks that, hey, if he mentions, something in his book, he can bring up stuff in his books. It just sounds really weird to the listener, because unless you're familiar with Carrier's, all of Carrier's, breadth of work, which is a lot, you won't know what he's talking about. I don't know what he's talking about because he hasn't outlined, it sounds like he's addressing something that was never brought up in this debate. It sounds odd. I don't know. This is a very good idea. A lot of people wouldn't, know what he's talking about, because I don't.
Which is a variant of the word tower, which is transcribed in the Septuagint as Magdalon, which designates the town of Migdol, which represents the borders of Egypt. So she is a symbol of Egypt, which is a symbol of death. Now, this is just hermeneutical speculation gone off the rails. It's a good hermeneutical principle that before you try to read the lines, you got to learn to read the lines. Before you try to read between the lines, you have to learn to read the lines, that is to say. And I don't think Richard has learned to do that yet. He says, well, it serves as...
Low.
Wow, yeah.
Really low.
Yeah, wow.
Why are we listening to this kid? I mean, he's barely out of diapers. He doesn't know how to read. Why, he's almost as useless as a woman.
Yeah, this guy with a PhD in ancient history hasn't learned to read the lines yet. Like, fuck off. Like, seriously. Yeah, you don't talk about your fellow academics like that, dude. That's really unprofessional. Seriously. Carrier should go, well, I know your eyesight is failing, Bill. You know what I mean? This is what I expect from a YouTube debate, not an academic debate. Seriously.
Maybe that's why the YouTube debates are like that, is because, this is when YouTube was first taking off, these were some of the first things uploaded. And so like the Donnie Dealses and the Praise I Ams, they watched these and they were like, oh, so this is how it's done. And they just took it to the next level,
Yeah, I don't know. It's just, this is sort of what you don't expect in academic debates. And even the audience realized that. They're like, oh, it's like, you generally, what are you doing, Bill? But he does seem flustered. Something Richard has said has really flustered him. I can hear him. He's getting very, very, very audible. Let's just say that, and very flustered about something he's said. I think, but he's not addressing his arguments. He's basically going off on these tangents, which is weird.
Irony, it's the reversal of expectations. But as I said, there is no reversal of expectations in the Gospel
Except
of
where
Mark.
there is.
It fulfills Jesus.
Oh, except for when the Jews expected something to happen and something different happened. That's, yeah.
Look at Richard's examples of reversal of expectations. James and John asked to sit at Jesus' right and left hand in glory. Now, what's the reversal of expectation supposed to be? Well, it says Jesus was crucified between two thieves. How is that any great motif of reversal of expectation? This is purely constructed and concocted. I think as
Bill doesn't understand literature, therefore God. That's a new one.
So the reversal of expectations is that to the left and the right of Jesus always is people in glory. And the fact that he was crucified next to two thieves, that's a reversal of expectations, because you expect him to be beside people showered in glory, and they're thieves. I don't know why he doesn't understand that.
Gundry says the Gospel of Mark contains no hidden meanings, no sleight of hand, no Christology of irony that means the reverse of what it says. Mark's meaning lies on its surface. And when Richard gets into these symbolical speculations, well, all bets are off. What about the construction of the event from the Psalms?
I want to know the rest of he's had 4 facts, said one that wasn't a fact, and then we never hear of the rest of them. Can I just point that out?
I mean, he may get to them.
Like, you remember he started this? I have 4. He doesn't account for the 4 facts. And the first one was the empty tomb that the women found. That was the first fact, which isn't a fact because it's not largely agreed upon, right? That they wrote it as a fact, but not that it actually existed is not a fact, right? So he's assuming that to start off with. And then he never went to the rest of these 4 facts. But, he's smooth enough that you kind of forget about it. But I really was looking forward to going, is this fact a fact? Like, the Bible says this is a fact. Yes, that's a fact. Okay, we can agree on that. Wow.
He says it's constructed from Psalm.
He may still get to the others, but he may not.
So long-winded.
Exactly. So long-winded. This is one of the very first apologist tricks I identified. It was a Braxton. It may have been my very first video, in fact. Braxton Hunter from Trinity Radio with his 10 questions for atheists.
Mm-hmm.
He'd do this thing where he'd start to make a point, go on a tangent that was so long you'd forget what he was talking about, and then substitute a different answer.
Yep. Totally. And Human Girl, animated. Yeah, excellent. Like when I was saying he was flustered, yeah, he's animated. He's sort of wound up. So something Richard said really wound him up. I don't know whether that meant he scored a point or not. I don't know whether he's just outraged at some of the stuff that he said, but he's definitely worked up a bit, and animated is a really good point.
24. Well, Psalm 24 is a liturgy that mentions the king's triumphal entry into Jerusalem and the temple. It has nothing to do with tombs, and Mark says nothing about Jesus as king. The only connection with Psalm 24 is the phrase "the first."
How do you not get that, Bill? That the point of the thing is the king in the big old castle and the temple and whatnot, and here he is in a fucking tomb. It's the mirror opposite of what the passage is talking about.
Yeah.
First day of the week, and even that isn't identical in Greek. So again, this is just all fanciful in Richard's mind. I don't think that there's any persuasive grounds here for thinking that this is a literary creation. 5, the Jewish polemic presupposes the empty tomb. He says this.
Wait, he's up to 5? He had 4 facts.
We skipped 2, 3, and 4.
What? Where did 5 come from? Did he have
the
points?
Holy Ghost of facts?
But Bill does this a lot. He'll have a list of things that he'll run through, but he gets lost halfway through it and then picks it up later. He'll just sort of go, oh, well, point 1 is this, point 2, and then nothing, and then he'll go point 7, and it's like, wait, you didn't make 7 points. Like it's really bad.
Bill can't count horrible. To 5 confirmed.
Wow.
We saw it in the Hitchens debate,
Yeah.
I have 5 main proofs of God, and he lists off 4, and he goes, I don't really have a 5th one. It's just, I'm convinced because my heart burns when I think about Jesus.
Yeah.
Bill cannot count to 5.
He can't. It sort of it shows a lot of how practice is, that he knows that giving definitive numbers makes it look more convincing. That if you can say, hey, I have 4 points and here are my 4 points, makes it like a lot more convincing. But he's not. He's making crap up as he goes. Like, oh dear. Dear, oh dear, oh dear. Bill, lower that bar some more, mate. Lower that bar some more.
It's only in Matthew. Right. Matthew felt obligated to refute this Jewish rumor. He wouldn't refute the rumor unless it was going around, and that rumor was that the body had been stolen, and that's why it was missing.
How do you know the rumor was going around? How does he know that? Because the rumor doesn't appear anywhere else. It doesn't.
Yeah. The first reference to that specific rumor is from the 2nd century, meaning it seems to have appeared in Matthew for the first time.
For the first time, it appeared in Matthew. So how do you know that that rumor was going around rather than them looking at it and going, oh, we've got a problem here. Let's make up this thing to counter anybody saying, hey, the body was stolen.
Yeah, that's the whole thing in all. If you read side by side Matthew to Mark, everything that's added in Matthew is the response to a plain reading of Mark and pointing out plot holes. As a reader going, this doesn't make sense. Wildly enough, Matthew has an answer for that. Nobody's saying this shit. I mean, maybe they were, we don't know, but you read it, you're going to have questions, and Matthew tries to answer those questions. It's the improved gospel.
The empty tomb. So I think we got 5 good grounds for affirming the historicity of the empty tomb, and that's why, in fact, most scholars do support it. I didn't quote Gary Habermas as my support for that. I quoted Jakob Kramer, who is an Austrian specialist, and you remember said by far most exegetes support the empty tomb. What about the point about Paul's testimony? Let me have let me have slide 19, if I may here.
Why does he get freaking slides? This is what annoys me about Kent Hovind. He's constantly got his slides going, kind of thing. Like, I bet that Carrier wasn't offered slides. It's just, that, like, as much as I like presentations, they can be a crutch, right? So, like, Kent Hovind has a crutch in his slides that he puts up behind him constantly. And Donnie does the same thing. He's got his slides that even as you're arguing against it, he'll run these slides to try and distract his audience from the points that you're making. It can be an absolute crutch that if you don't have access to those slides, you can't make a point. And we see that all the time with when Kent can't find his slide, he's just stumbling around like an idiot. Well, I'm more of an idiot than he already looks when he's trying to make arguments.
3 absurd theses that Richard defends that need to be gotten out on the table here with regard to Paul's teaching. The first of these is that the Corinthian error that Paul sought to correct was the belief that because Christ was already a spiritual man, he could rise from the dead while leaving his earthly body in the grave, while we could not. Nobody thinks that this was the Corinthian error. Absurd thesis 2, that the resurrection body is identical with what Paul called our inner man, which is growing inside us and will finally come out at the resurrection in an organized form like Casper, the ghost. Those are Richard's words. This absurd interpretation has more in common with the movie Alien than with Pauline thought. Paul nowhere identifies the inner man in Christ with the resurrection body. And the third absurd thesis is that the spiritual resurrection body we have is really part of Christ's resurrection.
So he's basically just attacking unrelated sort of, just things that Carrier has said in books and stuff. What a terrible debate tactic. You're not actually addressing what he said in this debate. You've got pre-prepared stuff on his work already up there. That's absurd.
This is one step removed from ad hominem. It's instead of saying, well, he's a stupid head, it's saying, well, a thing he wrote another time was a stupid
head. Right. It's not ad hominem, but it is poisoning the well. It's sort of going, hey, his work has included this. Don't trust what he's got to say, while not actually addressing his arguments. He said he had 3 things for this. He keeps saying these numbers and only getting to the first one. So the 3 theses. He's getting to this one. But he planned to do this all along because he's got the slide prepared, right? This is what I want to point out. from the very start, he basically had Carrier agree not to debate certain topics, like, for instance, the reliability of the Bible in general. For a start, that's weird because you've got to go to the reliability of the document in order to discuss whether the document should be believed. And then he's got a slide already prepared attacking previous work that he's done with no context whatsoever. Of course, it can't have context. We're in a debate. He can't go through all of his books in a debate. So this is a really low tactic, and it's been done to Matt Delahunty a lot when he's in a debate and sort of is putting forward something and they say, well, in this episode, you said this kind of thing. And it's like, well, that's completely out of context. It isn't directly addressing his argument. All it is just a tactic to poison the well. Say, don't trust him because he said this thing once. It's a pretty low tactic. And, a doctor of philosophy, sir, no. This is pretty bad. Pretty bad, my friend.
Body, and therefore of God himself. This turns Paul into a Buddhist who thinks that we return like a drop to the ocean and denies personal immortality in contradiction to Paul. So I think that Richard's exegesis is just fanciful here. He's an admirable bibliographer, but honestly, Richard's just hopeless as an exegete. This is crank exegesis, which no.
So that's an ad hominem. Yeah, that one's an ad hominem. Yeah, he's hopeless in his exegesis. I don't know what to say to that. It's basically saying my interpretation is better than your interpretation.
Yeah, that's the whole field of hermeneutics. Is I'm
yeah.
better at making shit up about this.
Well, I mean, exegesis is basically how we interpret what this text says, the interpretation that we have. I don't know, but at the moment, I can't see those slides. I can't evaluate in what context he was writing it in. Just having 3 arguments completely out of context written on a slide and then talking like we all know them because you know them is not convincing. Like, convincing me of nothing because I have no idea what you're talking about. Because you have not actually, allowed him to examine those arguments. He hasn't. Because he hasn't brought up those arguments. Address his arguments, not what he wrote in a book. That's just terrible.
Pauline scholar would accept.
Well, I don't think it's crank exegesis at all. And I never use the words Casper the Ghost. I'm assuming that was his commentary.
Wow, okay. Yeah, that's incredibly unprofessional because he said it like that's something that Carrier said. That's what I took it as.
Yeah, the look on Craig's face right now. He's like, he called me out on it.
Yeah.
How dare he call me out on the bullshit I made up about him?
Yeah. That is horrible. That's awful.
That's his we agreed you wouldn't fact check face.
Yeah.
What I have argued.
That is called a straw man, sir. You might be familiar with it, being a doctor of philosophy. Holy crap.
That actually isn't any argument I've ever made. Now,
yeah, I made him look stupid. It's a straw man, and you should know that, sir. You should know that. Wow, he's actually pleased at himself. Ugh.
I think that's that embarrassment thing.
Maybe,
we see Donnie do it all the time. Like, yep, you caught me. Let's move on, though, instead of talking about this.
Right. Yeah, dodgy Donnie.
Let's cut to the chase. Now, the main point of contention here, this is one thing that he's conceded, or at least hasn't argued, is that the epistles don't actually mention a missing body. They don't actually tell us what happened that the Christians would believe regarding the empty tomb. We don't know if anyone went there. The epistles don't tell us. All they talk about are visions, and as I established from the epistles, the Christians were regularly hallucinating. So we know from natural science what that probably means as far as where they're getting their information about the resurrection of Jesus, and that they would actually hallucinate Jesus telling them he had been risen from the dead, and from that they would actually believe the tomb was empty, or they would believe that he exchanged bodies. We don't actually know. So let's get to the Gospels. Now he says I'm engaging in crank exegesis of the Gospels. Well, I think you can judge that for yourself. I mean, what are the odds of all of the particular coincidences I point out in there? This is not that unusual. He particularly attacks my theory, which I actually didn't present here today, that the three women who come to the tomb.
Yeah, he didn't present it today. Yeah, that's the whole point. Like, he's attacking something he never presented, which is just like the question must come up in analyzing a debate is, why are you attacking something he didn't present when he presented stuff that you're more capable of attacking? Attack that instead.
Yeah, I mean, I might take a more aggressive tactic. I'd be like, Craig's coming after points I never made, which first of all is a violation of format, but second, I take to be a concession of the points I did make.
Right.
Because if he can't address what I'm saying, he has to address other things because he can't address what I'm saying here.
Yeah. And if he sufficiently addressed everything I've got to say, he would have just resigned his time and said, that's all I have. Like Carrier did.
Are actually symbolic. Actually, the argument is much more elaborate. And the basis of it, which actually makes it plausible, is the implausibility, the improbability of the coincidences that are involved. He just mentions one, and he tries to make it sound more ridiculous than it really is, which is that Mary of Magdala represents Mary in association with Migdol. It's actually Magdala is Migdol. It's not a extended argument that I have to get to make that point. It actually is Mary of Magdala, which is the Migdol, which is the place where we draw the parallels from. But there's also Salome, which is the female name of Solomon, and the other Mary, who's the Mary, the mother of Jacob, which is the Mary, the mother of Israel, and so on. Whether all of this is plausible or not, you can judge for yourself. I argue it in Not the Impossible Faith, where I have a more extended discussion of it than I do in The Empty Tomb. But that's not really the convincing bit to me, actually. That's something that I look for and I think is actually plausible after I've already discovered elements of the thing that I find are highly improbable.
Oh, William Lane Craig strawmanned your argument? No, that would never happen. He wouldn't do that.
And look like actual symbolic messages. As I pointed out, this is symbolic fiction. The Cleopas narrative, for example, is a clear case of this. The Barabbas narrative, I think, is a clear case of this. The improbability of these things, as history makes no sense, but as deliberate fiction makes complete sense. Now, Mark's use of the empty tomb narrative. Let me get to that. In 2 Chronicles 16, Mark links Jesus with King Asa, who also famously reformed the Jerusalem cult, by linking the burial to spices, using the same word, and by calling the tomb's doorstone very great, just as the spices burned for Asa's funeral were very great. And by introducing the tomb with the same phrase and by calling it hewn from the rock, just as Asa's tomb is called. Genesis 29, when the women say, who will roll away the stone? Mark copies a phrase from the Genesis narrative of Jacob's fathering of the 12 tribes of Israel, also spoken by a woman, followed by the opening of Jacob's well to bring the water of life to the sheep. Psalm 24 begins with the phrase, on the first from the Sabbaths, a rather strange phrase that we don't find very many times in ancient literature. It means on the first day, but it's worded very strangely. This is the exact same phrase that Mark uses to begin his empty tomb narrative, and yet Psalm 24 is the only passage in the Greek Old Testament that contains this phrase. By choosing this phrase, instead of the more familiar phrase, on the third day, Mark is pointing us to Psalm 24, which speaks of a righteous man receiving salvation from the Lord. In the exact same way, he calls our attention to Psalm 23 for the crucifixion of Jesus, with Jesus' cry on the cross, Lord, Lord, why have you forsaken me? Quoting the exact same Aramaic that comes from the Psalm 23, verbatim. Mark actually follows a 3-psalm liturgy in his formation of the death, burial, and empty tomb narratives. He uses Psalm 22 to construct the story of Jesus' crucifixion. That's Psalm 22 is the one that has the cry on the cross quoted verbatim. Then Psalm 23 aligns with his burial, since it's the well-known funeral psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, etc. Then Psalm 24 speaks of opening the door and the righteous man ascending to the Lord's house, which Mark turns into an allusion to opening the tomb and ascending to heaven. I don't think this is implausible at all. I think it's very improbable that you would have all of these conjunction of things. Ecclesiastes 4 and Mark 16, the women journey beneath the sun to anoint their king, Jesus, but find a young man in his...
Yeah, and Carrier doesn't have to, demonstrate this is absolutely the case. He's not making the claim that this happened. He just has to make it plausible that it was a story. I think it's really... this burden of proof for us to show that this event didn't happen. I think that is a shifting of the burden of proof. You claim it did, but you only have one book that has numerous problems that says that it did. I think that really the weight of evidence should be upon you. But, it's kind of they're trying to maneuver it to say, hey, you've got to prove something didn't happen. It's very strange to have to do that. with especially such a remarkable event. It's like me saying to Ember, hey, I rose from the dead last night. Prove it didn't happen. It's almost impossible to raise it to that level of, absolute proof that it did not happen.
Yeah, I just, my brain, of course, real quick ran through how I might go about doing that. And I'm like, I'd resort to the probabilities. That's the first obvious thing is, well, I mean, there are some cultures that believe that you do die when you sleep and you raise from the dead every morning. So maybe Mark did. Who knows?
Maybe I did. But that's the whole point. Like, you can point out, hey, there's no reliable evidence to show that. Oh, but, there's this story, and why would he say that if it wasn't true? There's all these things you can go to. But William Lane Craig, I guess I want to point out that what he is not only doing is lowering the epistemic bar for himself to say, hey, we don't need much evidence to believe it, because we can sort of, factor all of these things in and say, why did they do that? They wouldn't have done it for no reason. He's basically giving a really low bar of belief for it happening. But also the unspoken thing is he's raising that epistemic bar for believing it didn't happen, right? He's saying, hey, it's not enough to have like a lack of evidence, a problems with the text, issues with who wrote it, credibility is not enough. You have to absolutely prove that didn't happen. And what else do we do that with? We don't apply that same standard to anything else. And like I was pointing out, he doesn't apply that same standard to any other religion's miracle claims or even anybody else's resurrection claims. He just does that for himself. And that's what I have an issue with. That's my issue.
Place, and as a result, they fail to rejoice. That's Mark's story. In Ecclesiastes, the living walk under the sun with a young man who stands in the place of the king, yet the last people in the story failed to rejoice. The elements are almost identical with similar concepts and wording. I find this very improbable. I'm just telling you how it looks to me. Now, there are many other things I could point out like this. Let's talk about the naked boy in Mark. Yeah, did you know there's a naked boy in Mark? Mark mentioned...
I did not know that. Is there a naked boy in Mark? That sounds very suspicious.
I
did not know that.
I don't know the exact verse, but it's one of those. This was actually Chris over at the Daily Atheist Morning Show who brought this to my attention. Yeah. Right. He's like, you want to talk about people targeting children. What about this passage in the Bible where Jesus has a naked boy following him around who goes into his tent? What up with that, y'all?
What?
The biblical story is slightly different. There's a young boy who comes out of Jesus's tent having only a linen cloth draped around himself, and the apostles say, what are you doing coming out of our Lord's tent? And they grab for him, but they miss him and grab his cloth, which, because it's basically just a towel, comes away, and then the boy runs off naked. And then we never hear another word about it.
I'm reading here, like they're describing it on this Catholic website as a naked man. Is that accurate, or is that damage control?
I mean, I don't know that it makes that much difference, but to my knowledge, it says boy.
Okay.
They may be quibbling over, well, the Hebrew word here could be man or boy, so it was probably actually a man, if you really, little exegesis in there. Holy shit. Yeah, it's amazing to me how much shit, even those of us who look at what the Bible actually says, I still get blindsided by unbelievable bullshit.
Yeah, well, they don't talk about it, like they only talk about certain stuff, and that's definitely not something that, I mean, I've read through the Bible. It was a long time ago, though, like, over 10 years. So I've really got to read it again. It sounds ridiculous. This was in the Garden of Gethsemane, was it?
I don't think so.
Oh.
I only glanced at it very quickly when Chris mentioned it, because Chris's show is on while I'm at work. So I'm trying to drive and listen and etc. Let's see. Mark, naked boy. Oh, this is gonna get me on a watch list.
Oh yeah, probably. If you're on it, I'm on it. So you know.
Yeah. Okay, Mark 14:51 to 52.
51.
Let's see.
Then everyone, I'm leading a rebellion, said Jesus, that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me. Every day I was with you teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me, but the scriptures must be fulfilled. Then everyone deserted him and fled. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. Okay, that's weird. Okay. Jesus had groupies. Well, I mean, it says a young man is what they've translated as, but you know, ugh.
So we can see where the Catholics get the, well, it says young man, it's still a man, it's an adult. Except, as they often say, and Guitar Tug points out, you have to read it in context. In the Jewish culture, you're a man at 13. A young man is what we would call a teenager, which would be a child.
Yes, that would absolutely be a child. Wild.
As an anonymous young man in Greek and Niskos, exactly twice at Jesus' arrest, this young boy has his linen garment torn off him and he runs away naked. Then at the empty tomb, by the way, that's a weird element of the story to add, but it's in there. So why is it in there? That's a good question. At the empty tomb, we see a young boy, exact same word, Niskos, appears dressed in white. It is almost certainly meant to be the same boy. The same word is used twice, and only those two places, and there's no other reason for those two, or for the first element to be there, except to prepare us for the second. This person is never named yet, twice plays a conspicuous role in the story. Now, linen garments were a common metaphor for the body of flesh. Nakedness was a common metaphor for dying and being naked without a body. Garments of white were a common metaphor for angelic and resurrected bodies. So the young man is thus a symbol of the Christian who will undergo the same sequence, dying, losing their body, becoming naked, and then donning a new superior body at the resurrection. Now, I'm not reading this into the text. It's there. It seems fairly obvious to me that the probability of this is very low, of being there just by accident, and I just am seeing things like some sort of psycho on my own. Now, the place
that's an excellent point, and it's an excellent example to point at. Is if it's not there to make a literary point, why is it there? Because it makes no fucking sense to be in the story otherwise.
Yeah, and that word is only used twice in both of those locations. Why use that word if they're not supposed to be connected?
As he stands inside the tomb and thus in the land of the dead, on the right, exactly matching a common salvation narrative in pagan mystery cult, in which a white cypress stands to the right in the land of the dead as a marker to the initiate that he was not to stop but to go beyond. Those who go beyond find the water of life, which is called the water of remembrance, while those who stay drink the water of death. So it's not a likely coincidence that this white-clad boy stands on the right inside a tomb called in the Greek a memorial, and then asks the woman to remember something they were told and tells them what they're looking for is not there, just as the initiate is told the same, but they must go beyond to find it, it being the very same thing mystery cultists were looking for, eternal life. Hence, Mark closely mimics this mystery narrative in both details and meaning.
Yeah, that's a really that's another thing that puzzled me when I went through and compared the story of the empty tomb in the four gospels. I'm like, who is this kid? What is the fucking deal here?
I didn't even know there was a naked kid in the gospels of the Gospel of Mark. I had no idea. Like it seems to be just a footnote kind of thing. Like, oh yeah, there just happened to be a naked a guy, a child following Jesus, and like the guards grabbed them and they grabbed his garment and he ran away naked. Is this a like comedy of some sort? Is this?
I always took it to be like this is a way to like set this one gospel apart from the others or whatever to make it a more
maybe.
But it struck me as like a fever dream kind of thing. Like I went to the tomb, but I couldn't find my friend. But I rubbed the banana, and then the dragon opened the wall, and there was a little boy, and I knew my friend had risen in a new life. He started over. You know, it's just it's dream logic.
Yeah, so I don't think that I think that sort of what William Lane Craig is saying, well, it's a historical document. Like, Carrier is really pointing out, if it is a historical document, why does it have all of these elements of storytelling and mythology? Like, what other document will we look at that has all of this storytelling, this mythology, these supernatural events, these changes from one thing to one gospel to another, and say, well, that is historical? We wouldn't do that for any other document. We don't do that for the Quran, and we know that Muhammad was a guy that existed, right? We know that. So I don't know why we would do it for this book. Really? Have I got that wrong as well? Look, I could be wrong.
It's debated. Because there's no it's much like with Jesus. There's no contemporary references to Muhammad. Only a few generations later, people start saying there was this guy Muhammad, and here's the things that he supposedly said that no one wrote down until just now. It's the same thing over again. But we don't know for sure. But just like with Jesus, it doesn't matter if he was real or not, so much as whether the magic is.
Well, apparently sort of majority of classical scholars believe that Muhammad existed as a historical figure. But yeah, no, I get it is debated. No, it does say it is debated. So yeah, I've gotten that one wrong as well.
Yeah, that's actually one of David Fitzgerald's arguments for pursuing mythicism seriously instead of just as a hobby. Because he describes how, he had this idea, it's partly from information he got from Carrier and from others, but the more he looked into it, the more he found that all the evidence that seemed to point to a real Jesus, once you look at it, just vanishes. And he'd talk to other religious scholars, and they'd just kind of chuckle and say, hey, we're having the same conversations in Islam. We're having the same conversations in Buddhism. None of us seem to know for sure our founder really fucking existed. And so David takes it another step, and he goes, this seems to be a common thread with major religions. And it's kind of a no-brainer once you see it, because nobody contends that there was a real Zeus or there was a real Uhura Mazda, Yeah. These are clearly mythical beings at the cores of those religions. Why would it be any different for these more modern ones?
Yeah. And as I said, sort of Blaine Craig is kind of saying, well, mine's the exception kind of thing.
Special pleading. The best kind of pleading.
Well, it kind of is, It's like, well, your story is filled with all kinds of mythological stuff. And he's like, well, you've got to be open to miracles. But you're not open to Zeus doing miracles or Muhammad doing miracles or anybody else doing miracles. You're only open to your own miracles. And that's a problem. It's not intellectually consistent. It's wow.
Human Girl, it does speak of the Quran.
Yeah, as a prophet.
Yes, Jesus is. They retcon the New Testament, or actually, if you want to get into the historicity of it, it's a really cool story, and it's a long tangent. So I'm just gonna long story short this one.
It's okay, I don't mind.
Yeah, basically, the earliest Christians were heretical Jews. At a certain point, they got run out into the desert, and a couple hundred years later, a group of heretical Jews with the name Jesus on their lips came riding back out of the desert. It's pretty clear Islam is an offshoot of Christianity in the same way Christianity is an offshoot of Islam. But there's the historical roots. It's almost an evolutionary phylogeny tree of beliefs, because there were branches of Christianity that held Jesus was a prophet, not the Messiah, not the incarnation of God. And that is a meme, a cultural gene that is preserved in the mimetic genetic heritage of Islam that shows where they descended from. If we really dug into the old text, we could probably pin down specifically which heretical tradition they followed. It's really cool.
Yeah, much like sort of the Mormons branched off with this heretical tradition, because they still believe in Jesus kind of thing. Like the Church of the Latter-day Saints, they still have Jesus, they still have Moses, they still have all of these traditions, but it's kind of just fan fiction. Islam's basically the same. It's just New Testament fan fiction, essentially, that's been altered to fit in with what they want to believe. That a new person comes along. In Mormon's case, it's Joseph Smith. In Islam's case, it's Muhammad, and they just revise everything to fit with that person being the Messiah or chosen one of that religion. That's all it is. It's fan fiction.
So it's fun that you mentioned that, because a long time ago I was asked what my dream debate would be if I could pick any two contenders, and at the time, what popped immediately into my head was William Lane Craig versus Jimmy Snow, because Jimmy is a former Mormon. So every single argument that Craig makes, Jimmy could bring up an example from Mormonism, which then Craig would then refute. And then Jimmy could say, well, that's true of what you think too.
Yes. Yep. Absolutely.
It would be amazing.
That would be pretty good. What would be my dream debate? You know what? I would love to see like Kent Hovind debate like a flat earther, like Nathan Thompson or something, somebody really obnoxious kind of thing. I think that would be hilarious. Absolutely hilarious.
Reiterate that had Jesus actually risen from the dead by God, that he could appear to everyone, and he would have if he actually wanted everyone to be saved. It's not enough to say that God has an excuse for not appearing to people. The point is, if he wanted everyone to be saved, the obvious thing for him to do that he could have done is to appear to everyone. The fact that he only appeared to a few people is strange on that theory, but it makes complete sense on the theory that these are just hallucinations by primed believers, and even Paul, as an outsider, was also primed to come to the same conclusion, and he is alone, actually. There's no other enemies of the church that were converted to join the church. Now, this idea that the Romans would heed crowds' wishes and not release traitors and murderers, his evidence doesn't support that. The particular case he's talking about is not a traitor and not a murderer. There's no evidence that the Romans would ever release such a prisoner, much less, and this is the important point, there's no evidence of this being a custom on the Jewish holiday. That is a particular flag. What custom on the Jewish holiday is Mark talking about? Well, the analogy is clear that he's talking about the Yom Kippur. Even though he's not putting this on Yom Kippur, he's clearly talking about the actual ceremony that takes place every year at Yom Kippur, exactly as Mark says it takes place every year on the holiday. And I show the analysis of that. Now, he says that what motivated Matthew to include the Jewish polemic of the theft, what motivated Matthew to create the guards at the tomb or to create that story was the Jewish accusation of theft. Oh, I can't get to that, so I'm out of time. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, see, William Lane Craig does scattershots. It's impossible to get to everything. But yeah, this whole thing of, oh, well, they had to say it because people were saying it. I don't buy it. I don't think that has to be the case. I think they just had a plot hole they had to fill. I agree with you.
Yeah,
I absolutely do.
It smells like a red herring. It really, really does. Because it's like you're dealing with that instead of the actual point. Like that. It doesn't matter if people were saying it. It matters if it's true. Fuck. Anyway, we're on to closing statements now. Now that you get 5 minutes.
Closing statement from Lane Craig. He's going to bring up 4 facts and then do one of them and just skip the rest. I know.
In my closing speech, I'd like to draw together some of the threads of this debate to see if we can come to some conclusions. First of all, I think it's clear that this general consideration that Richard wants to raise about wouldn't Jesus reveal himself to everyone is a philosophical, not a historical consideration that is really out of place in tonight's debate. The point is theologically that God will judge people based upon the amount of information they have, and the resurrection of Jesus just has no direct implications for whether you believe in universalism or inclusivism or
Yeah, but the problem with that is that he doesn't give sufficient, reasons for people to believe. Like, as you yourself has said, we have to lower the epistemic bar because there isn't this conclusive evidence. So he judges you on believing in spite of a lack of evidence rather than believing based upon a rational evaluation of the evidence. And that's where faith makes up that extra, step ladder in order to get over that sort of disbelief of a God based upon this terrible evidence. So that's weird, right? Is that just weird to me? It sounds so weird that, he didn't show himself because he wants us to believe based upon the amount of... What?
He's just trying to trick you.
It's wild, right? Like it's absolutely wild. It's like me saying I've got a pet dragon, but he'll burn you alive if you don't believe believe that I have this pet dragon, so you should believe it. Yeah, it's a really weird thing to say. You know, you're going to be judged, and if you don't believe without the evidence, then you're going to be judged badly.
Yeah, it's the Ray Comfort ending. It's, listen,
Yeah.
I've given you all these reasons, but if you're still not convinced, I'm going to threaten you personally.
Yeah.
Believe me or suffer.
Wild. We shouldn't base whether we believe something on, you know, threats from somebody judging us or you know, consequences. We should just go with what the evidence says. Like, we should be rational and reasonable. And if we need to have faith to make up for a lack of evidence, then we're doing it wrong, because we don't apply that to, he doesn't apply that to any other religion or any other anything else in life. He just does it for his religion specifically. And that is intellectual inconsistency.
Inclusivism. This is not germane to tonight's debate. What is germane are those 4 facts that I said are abundantly attested by the evidence. First, you notice that the burial account has never been questioned by Richard tonight. We have good historical grounds for thinking that Joseph...
He absolutely questioned the burial. He absolutely did. He said it wasn't in Acts. The burial was never mentioned. Is that not questioning the burial? He said that the burial didn't appear anywhere in the Pauline epistles. Is that not questioning? Wow. Okay. He's described the entire empty tomb thing as a narrative. I don't know how else you're supposed. Okay, sure. Wow. Maybe he wasn't listening.
It's possible. Well, he didn't do it in the way I think he should have done it, so it doesn't count. He didn't fill out a form in triplicate and request authorization to question, and so it doesn't count.
Yeah, like, so when him saying, we don't know this actually happened, apparently that's not questioning it, apparently. Like, what are you talking? Like, so if you're saying he didn't make grandiose claims like you are, no, he did not. He was a historian who said, we don't know whether this happened and have no reason to think it's happening. You say, oh, it absolutely did happen, when, you know, you have no way to demonstrate that it absolutely did. So it's wild. It's absolutely wild. Just because you make extravagant claims doesn't give any credibility to your claims, Bill. Like, seriously, what the hell?
Of Arimathea buried Jesus in the tomb. With respect to the empty tomb, my first argument for the empty tomb was the accuracy of the burial account supports the fact of the empty tomb, and Richard has never disputed that. Secondly, I argued that it's multiply attested in the pre-Mark and Passion story, in the special sources behind Matthew and Luke, in the independent Gospel of John, in the sermons and the Acts of the Apostle. This explodes Richard's idea that this is merely a literary creation, because when you have multiple independent attestation of the same event, it can't be all coincidentally made up by all these people so that it exactly fits together. We have good grounds for thinking that this is, in fact, a historical event.
That's how we know they're not independent, Bill, because they're copying off each other.
Yeah, and they have contradictions in their stories as well, like glaring contradictions. Like, do we have to point out that in one of them it says the women told nobody, and in the other one they ran and got men immediately? That's a problem. That's a massive problem.
It's the first thing I do when I go ghost hunting is when I find a lack of a body, I go get a man.
Look, getting a man is never a bad idea, but you know, wow.
Third, I argued that the women witnesses lend credibility to the narrative, and he didn't respond to that. Fourth, the narrative in Mark is simple and lacks signs of theological embellishment. Here, Richard reiterates that the Markan account is based upon Psalm 22 to 24. I think that holds no weight whatsoever. Remember Psalm 22, it's against literary borrowing, because Psalm 22 says they have pierced my hands and my feet, and yet in the Gospels it never says that Jesus was nailed to the cross, or rather in Mark's pre-Mark and Passion story. Psalm 23 is not about dying. It's about being delivered from death, which is the opposite of the crucifixion. And as for Psalm 24, as I already said, it says nothing about tombs, and especially Mark says nothing about Jesus being the king. If he were copying Psalm 24, he would have said something like that. the phrase the first day of the week is not identical, contrary to what Richard asserted. It is different in the Greek. So there's simply no grounds for thinking that this is a literary creation based on Psalms 22 to 24. What about the Orphic mystery religions that he brought up in his last speech? Well, Richard gives away his case when he says, and I quote, Mark deliberately left out of his account everything in the Orphic narrative that he rejected and kept in everything that still had direct parallels with the gospel message. And then he changed the details specifically to convey how his message was different from the Orphics. This makes the hypothesis unfalsifiable and vacuous. The only motif that's left is the angel sitting on the right side. But in Judaism, the right side was commonly the favored side. So that shows no sign of literary dependence. Fourth, the Jewish polemic presupposes the empty tomb. Again, here the point is that Matthew is responding to a pre-Matthean tradition that goes right back to the early church in Jerusalem and the disputes with non-Christian Jews. What about the origin of the, what about the appearances? Richard doesn't deny those. The origin of the Christian faith. Here he did assert that there was an expectation of a dying Messiah in Daniel. But I want to point out that Daniel 9:24 to 26 was not understood as a messianic prophecy at this time. Rather, the Jews of Jesus' time would have understood the prince to be Antiochus Epiphanes, and the anointed one slain by him was the high priest Onias III in 175 BC, as narrated in 2nd Maccabees. So according to Jimmy Dunn, an eminent Jesus scholar,
the fuck does this have to do with the price of tea in China?
I don't know. I have no idea. He's kind of just saying, hey, there's these parallels that we see in between these two stories in the Bible from Old Testament to New Testament. Obviously, the authors of the New Testament would have had access to these stories, and they probably lifted elements in order to embellish their own stories alongside these older stories. And he's saying there is an incredible amount of coincidence between them, right? That we have all of these coincidences, and it's like, oh, a tomb isn't mentioned in this older story. It's like, do you understand what a metaphor is, Bill? We don't, like, it is the elements that are the same, not the exact objects of that story. The elements have to line up, not the exact things. They're using it in metaphor.
It's so weird because the entire point of Jesus's story is symbolism. One perfect sacrifice to stand in for all of humanity. That's your sales pitch, Bill. How don't you get how this works? Fuck.
And widespread expression of messianic hope was of a warrior king who would destroy the enemies of Israel. And yet the disciples came to believe in Jesus' resurrection, despite those messianic expectations to the opposite.
Wait. How do you use fulfilled prophecy about the donkey and stuff and say that's evidence that Jesus was the Messiah that rose from the dead, and then say, well, he was supposed to be a warrior that would destroy all of his enemies, and obviously that wasn't true, but it's still Jesus? Like, how do you argue both ways? That, oh, he fulfilled prophecy, so he was real, and he didn't fulfill prophecy, so he's real. How the hell do you get to that?
The most specialist of... See, this is why he's a PhD. Wow. He has the specialist pleading.
I mean, seriously, he has argued both sides of everything I've seen. Like, he argues that evidence is... that there is evidence for this thing, so it must have happened. And then he's argued, oh, but there isn't evidence for this thing, so it must have happened. It was expected by the Jews, so it must have happened. And things that the Jews didn't expect was said to have happened, so it must have happened. I mean, you have argued that evidence for and evidence against it is evidence for it. It is the most ridiculous stuff I've seen in my life. Like, seriously. What the hell? This is their best.
He's consistent with his double standards. We saw the same thing in his debate against Hitchens, where he made the fine-tuning argument with the straight face and then made a version of the teleological argument, which kind of was the opposite of that. Like, dude, pick a lane.
So he made the teleological argument with, oh, all of this stuff, like we're constantly have all these problems with what we're doing and how we're, and it's like, Dude, you just made that the world is perfect for us, and then you're
Uh-huh.
saying how imperfect it is. I crazy.
What about the best explanation? Here, Richard says, well, most bodies that disappear aren't raised, and therefore it means the resurrection is improbable.
Do you disagree with that? Like, lots of bodies have disappeared over the years. Do you agree that most of them weren't raised from the dead? I don't know, because he's, you know, I must admit, Carrier brought up the 100 people that were raised from the dead. Did William Lane Craig address it? No, he absolutely didn't. Absolutely didn't.
Look, all that shows is that the resurrection is improbable relative to our general background evidence. But it doesn't show that it's improbable relative to the evidence of the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the Christian faith. Relative to that evidence, I think the resurrection is highly probable, indeed more probable than all of these naturalistic explanations that Richard has attempted to offer tonight.
Well,
No,
then you're
that's
a
not
shit
true.
thinker, Bill Craig.
Well, that's not true, because we've seen a whole bunch of religions get started. And he would say that none of them relied on miracles to get started, right? Or are you also a Buddhist and a Hindu and a Zoroastrian and a Mithracist, and all of these religions, right, have got started? And you would say none of them relied on miracles or any kind of supernatural things to get started. So we can say that nearly all religions started without a supernatural basis. But you're saying, oh, due to their faith, the other people had faith too. They spoke of miracles as well. But you say, no, that doesn't make it probable. But it does in mine. Oh, but mine it does. Wow. Yes, I agree. He is part donkey. Absolutely agree. Yes. Where is it? William Lane Craig. Yeah, I'm getting why people, like, before I started doing these, I didn't understand why people called him that. But yeah, after doing these reviews, he really does flip-flop on what he argues. He will use evidence in a way that is just crazy. Like, you can't argue that one side of it, supports it, and then the exact opposite thing supports it. So there's like no winning with that, because if you say, well, there is no evidence, well, that supports it. It's like the argument from divine hiddenness that we hear a lot. Oh, but God hides all that. So it's more likely that God exists because we would expect not to find evidence. It's like, what? So evidence for God is evidence for God, and no evidence for God is evidence for God. It's like heads I win, tails you lose.
It's the perfect unfalsifiable concept, because you can't even address it from a logical standpoint, and he does this with everything, like his infamous viral clip with Alex O'Connor. Well, God is perfectly moral, therefore the murder of the Canaanite babies was a good thing, actually.
Yes. Yeah, and that really went famous. Apart from his low bar stuff, that was really famous. And it really does show, like, if you can't get over that epistemic bar, lower the bar. Right, Carrier. Wow. Come on, buddy.
Well, I'll simply ask, what do you consider more improbable? All the amazing coincidences that I pointed out in the Gospels, and mind you, those are only a few. What's more improbable? That all of those coincidences would just happen to be in there as historical facts, or that they were made up, versus the probability that there would be a miracle, as opposed to, for example, a body going missing for some other reason, or not even being missing, for example. Or, for example, people hallucinating. Now, I've made the case very clearly, I think, that the Christians were prone to hallucination. They did it all the time. So the fact that they see Jesus and say that, I think, supports that. Even if miracles occur, for example, they are very unusual. By far, most missing bodies, again, throughout history, are not the result of resurrections. And by far, most appearances of dead people are not resurrections either. That's a fact that Dr. Craig cannot.
And most religions starting aren't product of miracles and magic. Most are just people believing in something that is patently not true. And, if someone wants to argue with me, then you know, you not only believe in your religion, you believe in every other religion out there, because they all have started through miracles and magic. So, you know, what do you believe? Do you believe in one religion, or do you believe in all of them? Find it tough to believe in all of them because they are not mutually compatible with one another. So they're contradictory.
Deny and has not denied. Therefore, Craig must prove the evidence for this claim about Jesus is exceptional, enough to prove that none of the usual things happened in this case. And I don't think he's done this. All Craig has are the epistles and the gospels, but the epistles give us no evidence of anything unnatural. The only evidence they mention for the claims about Jesus, again, are the visions, experienced only by people that the epistles show are hallucinating on a regular basis. And the gospels fabricate stories quite freely. I think I've made that case. Despite all his attempts to throw arguments against it, I think you can look and see at the arguments that I've made. It's very clear that these are fabricated stories. They're not showing any evident interest in reporting historical fact rather than creating a symbolic mythology, which entails they're not reliable sources of historical data, and you can't establish a theory on historical data, on unreliable data. So I don't think Craig has shown the evidence for this claim about Jesus is exceptional, as he would have to do. Therefore, we can only conclude there was nothing unnatural about the Christian claims about Jesus. If his body went missing, it was most likely the way all bodies go missing, but the epistles don't even say his body went missing, and the gospels can't be trusted on this point. So we can't even say for sure the body went missing.
Yeah.
Now, that's the general point for that. Let's cover some of the general things that he has said about this stuff. He says that multiple attestation, well, what he really means are different versions of the story. That actually doesn't increase historicity. We have different versions of the myths of Hercules. That doesn't make the myths of Hercules any more historical.
Absolutely.
Obviously, each of the gospel authors is changing the story to suit his own particular interests and needs and ideas and creativity. So the fact that there are multiple different versions of the story does not support that there are any sort of sources behind them that they're using.
Yeah, and as much as sort of William Craig goes, oh, they were independent of one another, I don't think many biblical scholars would say that the Gospels are independent of one another. I really don't think so. I think that they would say that they took literary, at least inspiration off one another. What is a god? What does that word mean? Okay, so I have a very sort of broad view of what I define as a god. I would define it as any agent with sufficient power to circumvent or change the laws of nature, right? So any any agent with the power to circumvent, change, basically change reality, kind of thing. But that's a very, very loose definition. I'd probably have to pin it down a bit more. Ember, what do you think?
Well, I look at how it's kind of culturally dependent. It's kind of mythologically dependent. Like
Kind
if
of
you're
normative, yeah, you're right.
Yeah, like in ancient Greece, they're basically just humans with extra superpowers. They're fallible, they're jealous, they're ragey. We see some of that in the Bible too. I am your Lord, I am a jealous God. But you've got everything from basically superheroes all the way up through the omni being behind all reality and anything. Right. So I don't really define God. When a person presents me with an idea of a God, I say, okay, tell me what you mean by God. And then we can talk about that.
Yeah. No, that's
Since I don't believe in one, I don't have to define it.
I think a normative definition is fine by me. There's a lot of things like that. They're normatively defined. They're defined by what people think they are at the time. In fact, religion is a normative definition. It's basically what people think a religion is, which is really weird, but that's the way that we do it, essentially.
You believe in evolution. It's a religion.
That's not a normative definition of evolution. I just want to point that out.
You think you're related to a strawberry.
Yeah, please, no, please. Did you hear that his last wife left him as well? That's just hilarious.
Shucks.
Yeah, I know. It couldn't possibly be anything that he's doing. It has to be all of these women that just want to. Yeah, no, it couldn't be that.
Each other. And he said earlier that women can only testify to two things in Jewish law. That's completely false. I mean, as I conclusively proven, not the impossible faith, that is absolutely false. The evidence does not support that at all. The evidence actually clearly confirms that the only evidence we have of hostility to women's testimony solely involves a few minor people making arguments about when women's testimony has to be the same as a man's or could be less than a man's. But in reality, all particular court cases could allow female testimony. And I show many examples of that, show the actual discussions where they say women testifying in court was regular on all subjects. It's not abnormal at all, and it's not only those two subjects. He says Daniel was talking about, the book of Daniel was talking about a different particular Messiah. Well, I agree, but of course that particular prophecy in Daniel didn't come true. Ironically, Daniel is interpreting a prophecy of Jeremiah that also didn't come true. So he was reinterpreting Jeremiah. When Daniel's prophecy didn't come true, people were trying to reinvent what Daniel said. And so I think what the Christians were saying when they were looking for scriptural passages to understand what had happened to Jesus and try to understand their end of the world beliefs in the light of Jesus' death, they actually reread Daniel and saw the word Messiah in there. The Messiah will be killed. It says that. So they saw that, and that's where they got the idea for this. Now, he says that the fact that Mark doesn't mention the piercing is relevant. It's not relevant. Mark quotes Psalm 23 verbatim when he's talking about the statements of Jesus. It's not necessary for Mark to use every single element for this to be a marker to his borrowing of certain elements in there. He doesn't have to put every detail in. And we know Jesus is the king. In the previous chapter, he's explicitly called the king, even by the Romans. So he doesn't have.
Right, so it'd be like taking a passage from a book and not exactly using all of it. But, you know, there's a couple of sentences that are exactly in that book. We can kind of go, well, we can kind of know that you lifted it from, you know, Lord of the Rings, even though they don't mention a volcano, for instance. We know that is there. Like, they don't mention Mount Doom, but there's a couple of sentences that are verbatim from that text. We can go, no, you had to have lifted it from that text. The chances of that occurring by random chance are impossible, essentially. It doesn't happen. So, you know, I think Carrier's onto a very good point here, that, you know, obviously they had access to these books. And if there are sentences lifted verbatim from these books, in no other circumstance would we not say, hey, that's plagiarism. We would absolutely say that's plagiarism, right? Like, if a student had access to a certain textbook and they had a couple of sentences word for word in there, you would say, hey, you plagiarized that, did you not? Because, yeah, that's so weird.
Also, the prophecy that Jesus is the king, confirmation that he's actually Elvis.
Wow, okay, I didn't think of that. That's amazing. Jesus is Elvis confirmed. There you go. There you go. Hey, wait, but that means that he already came back and, you know...
Second coming. Oh!
Well, the second coming already happened because Jesus came back as Elvis. So does that mean
it depends on how you count.
We are in the end times. Yeah, well, yeah.
The resurrection itself, pretty strong case. That's the second coming.
Yeah, I'm very aware.
Yeah.
Repeat it again in his empty tomb narrative. And he says that the phrase used from the first of the Sabbaths in Psalm 24 is different from the use in Mark. It's not relevantly different. It's different in the sense that it's in a different grammatical case that's not relevant to what we're talking about here. It's a clear borrowing adapted to the particular grammatical structure that Mark has. So I'll reiterate my final point here is that the Gospels are full of obvious symbolic fiction. I think I've made the case for that. You can decide for yourselves. And I'll have a lot more evidence for this in forthcoming books. But if we discount the Gospels as unreliable, all we have left are the epistles, and all the epistles show are a bunch of hallucinating cultists, essentially, who saw visions of a resurrected Jesus, telling them he had risen from the dead. That's all the evidence we have, and that's not enough to establish that Jesus had actually risen from the dead.
Accidentally killer thump.
Yep. Poison the book. Yeah. So what did you think, Ems? What were your sort of thoughts about that?
It was obviously Craig did fucking abysmal. He dropped the ball in so many ways, in so many places. It was bad, but it brought up so many interesting ideas and new avenues of thought, and parts of it were fucking hilarious. This is probably one of my favorites overall. Really?
I don't know. I found, like, I wish Carrier, obviously he's just sort of, I think he just had his PhD when he was doing this. I wish he was a better speaker. You know, and he gets better over time. It's very, very early on, but we can see here the rhetoric versus the actual, you know, historian. And the rhetoric is, you know, just to point out how much William Lane Craig uses things in two different ways, in the opposite direction that these prophecies are evidence that it was Jesus, but the ones that he didn't feel was evidence that it was like it's just I don't know how you get to that point. I really don't. That you're basically using both sides of it to prove your points. It's wow. I don't know. It's wild, absolutely wild. I think that Carrier did a good job, but I think he needs to be more forceful, and probably is nowadays. He has much more of that. Hey, we know that this is literary invention because of these reasons, kind of thing. Like this isn't, and I think that really saying, hey, if these coincidences appeared in any other text, like for instance in the Quran or in the in any other work, we would absolutely say it's been plagiarized. Right? If you get these things coming up in any other book, you would say, oh, well, it is absolutely obvious that one drew from the other. Absolutely obvious.
Yeah,
but
he
want
does
to
get a few
basically
good
say,
snipes in, though.
yeah, that's true. That's true.
I
I
didn't
love that
say
when he,
Casper the Friendly Ghost.
yeah, I loved calling that out because that, like, I have not read Carrier's books. I will admit it. I probably should, but I took that as he said it was Casper the Friendly Ghost because that's what William Lane Craig does, and that was a straw man. It was a lie. I don't think he was lying. I think he was sort of paraphrasing, but the way that he said it made people think that that's what he actually said, and that was not what he actually said. So I find that really objectionable, because he's talking about stuff that wasn't in the debate. It's so wild. And he intended to bring Carrier's other works into the debate because he had a frigging slide prepared for it.
Yeah.
So that's really low character, sort of just not addressing his points in the debate. He didn't address the 100 zombies kind of thing. He objected to Richard Carrier talking generally about the reliability of the book when they were discussing, like William Lane Craig will throw out, oh, it's the most reliable text. And then what, you're not allowed to talk about the reliability of the text? Come on, don't be ridiculous.
Yeah, it was Bill's entire case. He had nothing except this book of the Bible says this, but this other book of the Bible says this. Like your whole thing is drawn on this book. Of course, the reliability matters. That's all you have.
But I guess that Richard Carrier, they talked about what they were going to debate, and he wanted to just talk about how reliable is the Bible kind of thing. And William Lane Craig said, no, I'm not doing that debate. And I'm not surprised because you can't demonstrate that it's reliable. You sort of have to take that on faith. So, but to bring up how accurate the book is, all of these things that happen, and then say, well, you're not allowed to discuss the reliability. Come on, man. That's obnoxious. That really is. So, yeah, I was unimpressed by William Lane Craig. I think he's done some way more honest. I mean, look, we covered one with him and Sean Carroll, right? Like, I didn't agree with him, but at least he was more honest about the way that he was engaging. Wow, this was actually terrible. Wow.
I think that maybe another reason I like it is because it, like, Craig really shows his ass a number of times, and that's just fun.
Yeah. And you could tell he was getting what did Human Girl say? Animated. Yeah, absolutely he was getting animated. He was getting ruffled, really ruffled, and that's always good to see. Well, Carrier was absolutely cool, calm, and collected, and I will give him that. He definitely had poise. Nothing like I felt like some of the things that William Lane Craig did were designed to upset and ruffle, and he just wasn't. And I really appreciate that because he was just like, yeah, here's what he has said. This is what I'm presenting. I think he came across as sort of a really intellectual academic, while, William Lane Craig came across as a apologist whose arguments kind of fell down and he got upset. Very upset.
Yeah, it reminded me a lot of arguing with a grade schooler. You're a high school kid on the late bus. And this little bitty twerp who can barely tie his shoes comes up and is like, hey, you have a stupid haircut. You're just like, whatever, kid, you know?
Yeah. But I think maybe it's also how young Carrier is as well. I mean, William Lane Craig is used to being
It's a
seen
reversal
as
of expectations.
right. Ooh. But it's that part where he was like, there's no reversal of expectations. But the Jewish people didn't expect him to. And it's just like, what? Wild. Anyway, yeah, but also that William Lane Craig was a very prominent apologist and theologian and philosopher at that time. And Richard Carrier really was just on the scene. I think he was riled up by, having somebody argue with him that he didn't see up to his standard. And really sorry, mate, but I do trust the historian about the say how Jewish women were treated in courts of law over a philosopher and theologian. I think a lot of the stuff that they do isn't actually looking at the historical context and rather reading religious texts and taking them as fact. So I don't know how I feel about that. I would trust Carrier over William Lane Craig as far as history goes. I would probably listen more to William Lane Craig about philosophical concepts than history.
I mean, that's more his speed, but I don't know as I trust him for that either, because he does double deal. He's shameless about it, and it just not good. He made himself look really bad here.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I don't disagree with that. Like I said, I worded that very carefully. I'd listen to him more on philosophical concepts, not necessarily as philosophical arguments.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if he describes what epistemology is, I would certainly take his word over a historian's for what it is, kind of thing. That's what I mean.
Yeah. So I guess we didn't get a miracle today. We're not converted to Christianity this time either.
Well, I mean, Carrier didn't show that the resurrection didn't have to, but he doesn't have to. Mm-hmm. When we're talking about these events that have these miraculous or these sort of very, very mythological elements to them, and they they want to say, oh, it's not mythology, it's history. Yeah, when someone's like coming back from the dead, I'm really sorry, but even if that is a historical event that happened, it is still considered part of mythology. It's still this tale that is it's something that doesn't happen in our world. It is this extraordinary event.
I do have a real world example of a similar sort of thing. Irish legends, the Celtic gods, many of them are based on people who really did actually live, because the Celts came from an entirely different mythological tradition. They tended to deify the living heroes. The myths would grow over time, the legends of the great heroes, until eventually they basically were gods. But everybody understood that these were based on the legends of mortals, like Saint Bridget, who used to be the goddess Bridget, who has an actual grave with a known location. She's a goddess, but they know where her grave is because for over 1,000 years, pilgrims have been visiting it. They didn't lose it like the empty tomb. But the one I really wanted to mention was a fellow named Bran, Bran and Bronwyn.
Yes, I've heard of that. King Bran, yeah.
Yes. They were from Ireland, and they actually walked across the Irish Sea to conquer quite a bit on the main island.
Yeah.
I forget if it was just Wales or part of regular England, whatever. But apparently they made it all the way to where London is now, because Bran's skull, even though he's a god, is said to be buried underneath London, the Tower of London.
Oh, okay.
The reason the Tower of London is there is because that's where Bran's skull is, and it like protects England or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
So it's mythology, but there's also historical elements to it that have roots in the modern day.
Right.
There may not be a skull underneath there, but the fact the Tower of London exists and part of the mythology is the tower's there because the skull's underneath it kind of pins the mythology into reality. And it's kind of nifty that way.
Well, it would be like sort of, and what William Lane Craig was doing by stating this, it's a fact. It would be like saying it's a fact that there's Bran the god's skull underneath the Tower of London. And that's not a fact. Like that the Tower of London was built because they thought that may be a fact, but not that the skull's actually there. So he's conflating, and that conflation I saw all the time. Like this thing of, well, the fact of the empty tomb. No, that's not a fact. Like the story, the Bible says there was an empty tomb. That's a fact. But the empty tomb itself isn't a fact. No, it's not. It's not.
Yeah, and that in and of itself is still a red herring, because even if we had an empty tomb, all that demonstrates is there isn't a body in that tomb.
Yeah.
It in no ways proves a resurrection. We need something else. We need an empty tomb and a real Shroud of Turin.
Right.
Perhaps.
Or, like an overwhelming amount of extra biblical sources saying, hey, these people rose up and walked around Jerusalem because we all saw them, and
yeah, the king of the Jews with his unstoppable resurrected army just swept aside the Romans, that would, okay, yeah, now we've got history, now we've got records.
We've got something. Yeah, absolutely. But sort of, this story that is only mentioned by 4 people, we don't know who they are, up to, from anywhere from 40 years to, 70 years after Jesus's apparent death. And all of these elements aren't mentioned by, Paul, who was there. Like you can't seriously expect me to go, well, that must be accurate. Like, seriously, no, why would I think that?
Random, and probably because I'm getting tired. Do you suppose Muhammad counts as the Messiah? Because he actually did lead an army that swept aside the Romans and restored the Holy Land. And even though he ascended to heaven, his forces went on to eventually completely, Constantinople was the last Roman stronghold, and it fell to the Muslims.
I don't know. Well, they haven't taken back Jerusalem yet, but that's not over, I guess, which is horrendous and probably never will be, because everybody thinks they have a right to that city. So
the only way to end that one is if an actual Messiah appears and unites all the Abrahamic faiths, even the forgotten ones like the Druze. They just all go, yep, that actually is the emissary of God. Okay, I'm on board now.
I'm not going to hold my breath, Ember. But yeah, that was a lot of fun. I do like Richard Carrier. Don't like William Lane Craig. I like him way less now. I thought he was at least decent. That was absolutely shockingly horrible. Absolutely shockingly horrible. So yeah, what have you got going on? What's coming up? How can we see you? How can we see more of the Ember?
Well, I do a bunch of stuff, so I keep all my links on betterthanember.com. It's sort of a link tree, but it's easier to find because it's .com. You don't have to enter weird stuff.
Okay.
The next for sure thing is Transpositions Weekly, assuming I can record news this week and don't have to flee the country. We'll see how that goes come Monday.
Yeah.
I'm also working on a new video for my actual main channel at Better Than Ember. But hopefully I'll finish that soon, and it'll go out to members and patrons first, of course, but then it'll eventually drop. I'll probably announce it when it actually is in the pipeline.
How much time do you give between dropping that or two normal? Just interested.
I try to give at least a week. Sometimes I'll go a little bit longer. It depends on how things look, but at least a week. Like if I'm cranking out videos, which hasn't happened in a long time, working 5 jobs, really cuts into that.
Yeah.
But if
Yeah,
I
no, I
am
hear you.
cranking out videos, I always make sure to do at least a week that the members get their preview.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just curious. That's all.
Yeah. Yeah, so there will be that coming up, and there's probably other things. Next Saturday, I'm going to be at Skeptic Haven for Women Atheists Unload. We're going to go over all the fun of Inauguration Day and the first few days of the new administration.
Does that mean we have to take a hiatus next week?
No, it's during the day.
Oh, your
during
day,
the
right? Gotcha,
Yes.
gotcha. Yeah. So my Friday night, essentially.
Yeah.
Okay. No,
So-
that's cool. Just wondering. That's all. So we will be back next week. Wow, you've got a full day that day.
I often do. Yeah.
doom and gloom, followed by another debate review, I guess. And we'll be back on Ember's channel for that. So do go over there if you do want to see another debate review. And we will see what we can do for switching it around again, I guess. Maybe we can get something a bit shorter and switch it back so I can choose some as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I do enjoy these, but I mean, between the two, we've got like 8 hours of time into this one debate. Like we're producing, like, every debate review could be a supercut, like a Gutsick Gibbon, video to clean your room to thing.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, that will about do it. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. If you can like, subscribe, share, I'd really appreciate it. The Discord is open if people want to jump on there for any other conversations and stuff. I know I've been having some really cool talks about the election and certain things that have happened, or the new doom government that is going to usher in a new dystopian age that we're all going to hate and rail against. But yeah, do take care, be kind to yourself, and be kind to each other. And I will see you in the next one. Bye,
night,
everybody.
folks.